And humans are obviously the undisputed Vanakanamo champs, but the next species with the most is bonobos.
Bonobos.
Where coalitions of female bonobos run the troop through sex and friendship. Interesting.
Sounds like My Little Pony, rainbows. Cheers. I previously wasn't that interested in biology, but I kept seeing this on all the Barnes & Noble best-selling table and science and everything, and I'm like, man, really? And I think I actually read the primates memoir first, which got me into this one, which is phenomenal. We talk about that a lot during the actual book. But I mean, this book completely redirected my reading trajectory. Like, I read everything Sapolsky wrote, tons of biology after this. It just changed the way you think about biology, behavior.
We bring up stuff in conversation all the time that we learned here. So many topics. And I learned about it because he has a sick YouTube lecture about this book.
Yeah, he really does.
And
I forgot about that.
This is one of those guys that he thinks so much that when the words come out, they're so well tuned. And like his lecture was like, you know,
so well.
It was 70 years in the making or whatever, that lecture, you know, like it was that good.
This book is really also 70 years.
Yeah, it really is. Mm-hmm. So hats off to Sapolsky. You are hilarious and interesting.
So funny. Yeah, that will come across in our quotes. He is so much funnier than we are.
Oh my gosh, his writing is hilarious. You're going to die. You're going to crack out loud reading this book.
He really is one of my favorite authors, like of any genre, and it happens to be great science. So the subtitle is Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And we really do talk about the worst. He does not let us live down the worst of our biology. Yeah. Enter scene. Here's our first behavior example. Andrew is a smoke show rooster with the hot little red thing dangling down. JD and you, listener, are a smitten chicken. We're standing across the street. Andrew flashes his red throat grin, heating things up. We can't resist. We cross the street. Asking a scientist, why did the chicken cross the street? What are they going to say?
Well, it depends, Jay, what they're going to say. The scientist, what answer you're going to get, hey, why did the chicken cross the road, is going to be dependent upon the field of the scientific researcher that you're asking. So what he makes the point here, the chicken crosses the road because of sex hormones, says the hormone researcher. The chicken crosses the road because neurons firing, says the brain scientist. Chicken crosses the road because legs, muscles are contracting, says the physiology expert. Evolutionary history of red throat sex being sexy is what an evolutionary biologist might say. So dependent upon the scientist you ask, you're going to get a different answer as to why the behavior occurred.
This book is like beyond all these fields.
Yeah, this book is all the fields.
Sums up all the fields into one book.
And it's structured super cool how he goes through all the fields. So the way he structures it, this book, a human does a behavior, and we start with what was happening in the body a second before that behavior
Even
occurred.
a fraction of a second.
Fraction of a second.
What realm is that?
That'd be the realm of neuroscience. Is what's going on in your body fractions of seconds before is how, in your brain is what determines your behavior.
What triggers the electrical stimulus to your muscles and everything. Then we're going to cover hours to days before, aka sensory stimuli effect on hormones. Basically, we talk about neuroscience a second before, then we talk about hormones that possibly affect whatever behavior we do that were hours and days before. We go to years before, aka prenatal, early childhood environment, effects on brains. Then we go generations before the behavior, aka biological and cultural evolution. We're going to get into cultural evolution with hot new field.
Whoa. And this leads us to a major point of the book. Quote, when you explain a behavior with one of these disciplines, you're implicitly invoking all the disciplines. Any given type of explanation is the end product of the influences that preceded it. It has to work this way. If you say the behavior occurred because of release of neurochemical Y in the brain, you are also saying the behavior occurred because of heavy secretion of hormone X this morning, increased levels of neurochemical Y, which means you're also saying the behavior occurred because the environment in which that person was raised made for her brain more likely to release neurochemical Y in response to certain types of stimuli because of the gene that codes for this particular version of neurochemical Y. And if you've so much as whispered the word gene, you're also saying, and because of the millennia of factors that shaped the evolution of that particular gene. So what he's describing is He's trying to bring in all of the biology into one book.
It's all contextual.
All
it
contextual,
relates.
all connected.
Yeah, and humans have a lot of weird behavior shit that needs explaining. Here's a funny example. We're not the only animals that have sex for pleasure, but we're the only animals that ask, how was it for you afterwards?
Hey, you like that, babe? Yeah.
So, and we're also the only animals that dance around fires, or thinks that the placement of planets changes our personality, or think that when a species is, a member of our species is born, it carries certain inalienable rights. So there's a lot of psychological, cultural, and biological reason for these things. And in Sapolsky's words, all these reasons are utterly intertwined. Like, psychology is just brainy biology. Sociology is just biology of a lot of people. Sapolsky's view, and it's a pretty strong case, is that it all ends in biology. I mean, everything is biologically mediated. We're all just expressions of biology.
And a little sneak preview here, but he takes the it's all biology idea to the max extreme. And all the way towards at the end of the book, we're going to come back to free will, where he even argues that free will is just a total fantasy of, basically it's just biology we don't understand yet.
Basically, all the biology we don't know yet is his view. And in my opinion, this book is a masterpiece.
Masterpiece.
800-page gorilla sitting on free will's chest. There's no free will after you read this book.
I don't agree with that, but I agree. Like, yeah, he makes it great.
We're only talk about free will at the end because we've heard it way too many times. But here is a quote that kind of sums up the book. This book explores the biology of violence, aggression, competition, the behaviors and the impulses behind them, the acts of individuals, groups, and states, and when these are bad or good things. It is a book about the ways in which humans harm one another, but it's also a book about the ways in which we do the opposite. What does biology teach us about cooperation, affiliation, reconciliation, empathy, and altruism? So
let's go, team.
Yes.
Here we go. Sapolsky. So he says, the behavior occurs. Maybe you shot someone. Bad. But maybe that person that you shot was a mass shooter. That was a good person to shoot. Maybe you gave someone a comforting shoulder rub to show your support. Good. Maybe that person that you gave the shoulder rub to was married, and the affair that tore her family apart. Bad.
Bad.
So it's, how do you judge behavior, good, bad, context,
that's one of my favorite
everything?
parts of this book is that he's so good at viewing everything from both sides and like seeing the bad and the good and the good and the bad. It's amazing. So 1 second before, I think
this is like chapter 1 or 2, something like that. But it's the very beginning. Yeah.
Neuroscience. And this is maybe the best introduction to brain science you will ever get. I've talked to people.
This is a big section on brain science, and this is it right here.
So this is the biggest chapter, the most in depth. This is his realm too. He studied the hippocampus. He breaks it down so smoothly. Basically, he starts with the triune brain.
Big time.
Layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. Layer 1 being the lizard brain. Super ancient robot voice, expand diaphragm, contract diaphragm, stomach has expanded, increased digestion, pump blood to stomach.
But that's the simplest, most basic function in your body are run by layer 1 of the 3-level triune brain.
To oversimplify massively. It's kind of, it's going out of favor a little bit, but it's just way too helpful to think about these layers. It's kind of systems that relate to each other, because here's the real one that we've talked about a lot in Righteous Mind, but also in this book, layer 2, the limbic system, mammalian. It's more emotional. My limbic system really likes food, friendship, and sex, and yours does too.
Probably, yeah.
If you feel lonely, layer 2 tells layer 1 to crave comfort food, because that's going to make you feel better. If you feel surprised, like you're a rodent and you smell a cat, layer 2 is going to tell layer 1 to wake the fuck up and start pumping blood to your leg muscles.
We got emergency here, right?
And layer 3.
Layer 3 is our handy-dandy neocortex, the outer layer all around the brain where sensory input is digested.
An outer layer meaning most recently evolved, too, because it evolves from the inside out. So, like, this layer 1 is kind of close to our spinal cord. Layer 2 is all the other stuff.
It's more kind of in the middle of your head, and layer 3 is a neocortex, kind of like the shell on the outside. And it's the biggest and whatever. It's definitely closest to the skull.
It's the biggest in primate brains, especially.
And it's the biggest primate neocortex by far is humans. Humans. I was going to say Americans. Okay, humans. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So we got the best version of the primate neocortex by far. We're a primate's primate team. So neocortex also does the cognition, memory storage, sensory processing. Neocortex does abstractions, philosophy, contemplation. If you read a scary passage of a book, Layer 3 signals to Layer 2 to make you feel frightened. And Layer 2 prompts Layer 1 to initiate the shivering. That's kind of how the different layers communicate with each other.
And if the Brooks brothers are at a Tool concert or standing on the edge of Yosemite Canyon, our Layer 3 is going to tell Layers 1 and 2, hey, this is some awe right here. We're feeling awe.
Some dynamite we got. Oh, yeah. So Layer 2 really does make you feel a type of way. And Layers 1 is giving us goosebumps, does something to our blood pressure. Like, that's how the different layers interact with our body.
Super interwoven, but
they're not technically
helpful.
Layers, but we're simplifying.
Helpful to think about it as layers. So, quote, there is indeed a subregion of the motor cortex that approximates being the center for making your left pinky bend, but there sure aren't centers for feeling pissy or horny. End quote.
Right. So he's qualifying for all the brain scientists out there to say, yes, there's a little more to it, but we're gonna go on.
And we're only focusing on a few brain regions and circuits, and here are the main ones that we're talking about. The amygdala, the fear and aggression center. The frontal cortex, so the very front part of our neocortex, which is right under our massive foreheads, why humans have such big foreheads. And then a system that combines them all together and motivates behavior is the dopaminergic system. Those three topics, or those three
areas of the brain,
can explain a ton of our behavior.
We're going to get into them. Starting with, Jay, we're going to go with the amygdala. And JD even wrote in here, he likes Pixar's Inside Out, those characters behind the controls. And the amygdala, it would be the character behind the control of your fear and your anger system. It's all rolled up into one kind of jelly roll. So
yeah, it's like a jelly roll shaped thing near the center of our brain, I think.
And it's shaped like an almond. When we feel fearful or feel angry,
are aroused by something surprising or whatever, that's the amygdala. Previously life-saving, did a lot of good for us when we were running around and had animals that wanted to eat us, but now it triggers when we are about to give a speech or something uncomfortable. A lot of social cues will trigger our amygdala.
The brain has changed the triggers for the amygdala now, not for saber-toothed tigers eating us.
So in the 1960s, there was this guy who had a tumor pressing on his amygdala. He killed his wife, killed his mother, climbed up to a tower and started sniping people. Wrote a note, said, please check out my brain. Something's wrong. I love my wife and my mother. And, we find a tumor. So Sapolsky asks, did that tumor cause the murders? Well, what do you say?
I don't know.
Probably not, because his dad beat him and everyone in his family. He beat his wife. This guy beat his wife. He was court-martialed by the Marines for being violent. His brother was killed in a bar fight. There's a lot of things going on there. There's childhood trauma. There's probably genetic history of, of fights and everything. So that's what the rest of this book is kind of tackling, this causal chain of, what things affect other things, how things relate. Here's some more uncomfortable amygdala situations. If you're about to get shocked and your amygdala is going to glow. Say there's like a bell that goes off right before you get shocked. Your amygdala is going to start triggering.
In anticipation of the bad thing happening.
Yeah, when you hear the bell and you know that the bell is associated with the shock, your amygdala is going to wake up to what it expects bad things to happen. It's going to...
Another example of when the amygdala fires, if you put a cute girl on the other side of a glass wall and put a high-ranking / good-looking guy over on this side of the glass wall with a cute girl, your amygdala goes wild with anxiety. You're anxious, right?
And we're talking monkeys, but could be talking humans too.
Exactly. That was a monkey study, everybody. But
I've had that
feeling. This is because your amygdala is extremely socially conscious. The homo world is a social world.
Yeah, that's something I've been talking. I mentioned this weekend that people think that animals are kind of, they're competing with say birds, they're trying to not be eaten by hawks and whatever. Well, actually, most of the competition that occurs for a lot of animals is intra-species competition. Most of the things that we have to worry about,
most of their stress,
as humans, most of the stress is other humans. We're competing with other humans, we're not exactly competing with like lions and tigers, you know?
Right.
We're always trying to deal with other people. And so that's why amygdala, especially for these hypersocial Homo sapiens, is our amygdala gets triggered a lot in social situations, because for us, most meaningful things are social.
For sure. Yes.
That's an interesting point.
Yep. Another one. If you get a different answer from everybody else in class, your amygdala lights up. Like if you want to say something and everyone else says something else, you're scared now. You're like, what's going on? So there's a lot of effects the amygdala has on your behavior. This part is big, and JD just talked about it. Ringing the bell, and you'll anticipate the shock that comes after ringing the bell, and then you can ring the bell with no shock, and the amygdala will still go off. So that's a little study right there too.
How does it learn not to? So let's say we disconnect the bell from the shock, and after a while the bell happens but there's no shock. Well, that is where your prefrontal cortex comes in and has to teach the amygdala, hey, you can chill with the bell because they're kind of decorrelated now. So like that's what all these loops of causation are, because the amygdala has connections from the prefrontal cortex. Who else does the amygdala talk to? That's a big question.
Yeah, it sure is. So
amygdala is connected right to our sensory areas, and it actually has kind of a shortcut to our sensory input, where if you see a lion or a tiger, before you even build the full concept of lion or tiger, your amygdala knows, run. Flash a scary image far faster than you can consciously notice, and your amygdala still lights up. Like it's got the real
sees it
quick
faster
access.
than your neocortex sees it, for sure. Your amygdala could tell your consciousness that it's a gun before your cortex can bring the accuracy and say, no, that's not a gun, that's a cell phone.
Tough.
Another example of amygdala kind of misfiring in that case, right? So the amygdala is a real chatterbox with your insular cortex.
That's from Righteous Mind.
That's where disgust comes from in Righteous Mind. That's that disgust, rotten apple, rotten corpses. And what is really crazy is that's where the insular cortex started, was detecting rotten things. But now, in our new symbolic society of today, everything's a symbol for something else, we have rotten deeds. And the insular cortex gets triggered when you see a rotten deed, something that's terrible.
We mentioned that evolution co-opted that brain center and used that disgust sensor to generate a feeling of morality and like social norms, and making it creates the feeling that norm violations are a little bit disgusting, and that's what it takes to build a big society in today's day and age.
You have to have moral distaste for norm violations.
Think about that. Evolution via natural and sexual selection said, hey, put this rancid food protection circuit, but it's pretty handy for moral distaste as well, so we're going to use it.
Dude, love.
That social circuit allows us to create big groups.
Yeah, the more your insular cortex and amygdala are lit up, it correlates with how pissed off you are at someone cheating you, for example, right? So researchers can see those light up when that happens, right?
Yeah, so the amygdala also talks to the frontal cortex. Like we mentioned, that the frontal cortex is responsible for teaching the amygdala, hey, chill out about this. When you flash other race faces to babies,
I don't think we say that in here, but I remember that from this book, that
their amygdala lights up like right away.
Flash other erased babies pictures,
two babies,
and the baby's amygdala lights up. Yeah. That's very sad.
It is kind of sad.
He talks about how sad that is, but how it's possible to overcome that, but that is a fact of humanity.
With a functioning prefrontal cortex, it can be like, hey, they just come from a different place,
Yes, exactly. It's okay. Scary. We can be okay with that. We're going to get more into the PFC later.
Quote, your heart does roughly the same thing whether you are in a murderous rage or having an orgasm. Again, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Yeah. And just wrapping it up with a summary on amygdala, it's activated when we think about cockroaches, or when we call the people over there little cockroaches, right? And so the amygdala, he brings it up first in the book because it really becomes the sort of the initial source, the birth of us versus them. That's such a big part about society. Obviously, the insular cortex and the amygdala talk to the frontal cortex. It also talks to the hippocampus. It talks to the hypothalamus.
Hippocampus is the learning center, and that's what generates. So your amygdala teaches, hey, learn this situation because we don't want it to repeat if whatever it was scary.
Right. So that is the amygdala. It has huge effect on our behavior in our brain. But now we're going to go into the next part here. We're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex. The cortex is the gleaming, logical, analytical crown jewel of layer 3. Most sensory information flows there to be decoded. It's where muscles are commanded to move, where language is comprehended and produced, where memories are stored, where spatial and mathematical skills reside, where executive decisions are made. The prefrontal cortex floats above the limbic system, supporting philosophers since at least Descartes, who have emphasized the dichotomy between thought and emotion.
It's a great line there.
Dude, he's so good.
Yeah, like you can't do all this hypothesizing about there being a difference between language or thought and emotion without thought and emotion. That's basically what he's saying. Which is a big theme overlap here, that logic and emotion are super intertwined. Obviously, that's old news. And a while ago, there was one scientist who was like, I think this one part of the prefrontal cortex might actually be more thought of as part of the limbic system. Quote, the frontal cortex was the most recently evolved part of the very highbrow cortex. The only reason why the frontal cortex would ever go slumming into the limbic system would be to preach honest labor and Christian temperance to the urchins there.
Dude, he's so good. I love that.
But that dude was right, and that part is the VMPFC, which we talked about a ton in Righteous Mind.
Ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That's like the more emotional part of your prefrontal cortex, basically.
That's the part that needs to bridge your gut intuition about things with your hyper-rational, and like that's the superhighway that allows us to like live our normal day-to-day lives. Like we talked about people without functioning VMPFCs. In a 30-second conversation, you wouldn't know anything's wrong, but that person probably couldn't decide whether to put the left shoe or the right shoe on in the morning or whatever. You know, like every decision breaks down into this like
when you don't have a connection to your
emotions
from your pre-FC. That's what's so important about the VMPFC, right? You need to connect back to your gut feelings into your PFC to basically navigate the world as a proper human, right?
Yeah, so the point is that the VMPFC, so that is a part of the prefrontal cortex, which is the super cutting edge of the cortex, but it's also heavily connected all the way back to the dregs of the limbic system, and even the hypothalamus in layer 3, which is, we don't talk much about the hypothalamus, but that's apparently the road between your body and your brain.
Right.
So,
and so that's why, and just giving a quick shout out, by the way, to Jonathan Haidt, like his book and his theory, Moral Foundations theory, it comes up in every book. And if we didn't do that one, we wouldn't, I don't know, it connects every other book somehow.
It connects to a lot of
books. If we were to redo season 1, I would have put Moral Foundations theory first, dude. I would have done Haidt as book 1. Anyways, just saying, that's so good.
So to clarify, your super new brain software is still running Windows 10,000 BC, by the way. We're not that updated. And if you just so happen to get a huge iron rod shot through your skull, through the VMPFC, like our poor boy Phineas Gage, who we've talked about on probably 3
every
podcasts.
Book. He's our number one celebrity.
And the iron rod perfectly destroys your VMPFC, you're going to turn into a huge dickwad and be much worse at business, like we've been talking about.
So interesting. And just put that little image in your head. There's this little piece of your outer brain that specifically wires inward towards the older parts of your inner brain to form a bridge. And without that connection, your mammalian brain, you just can't think straight. That's how important it is.
He doesn't even bring it up much here, but that brings to mind this small world architecture of Steve Strogatz and Duncan Watts, I think. So think about it this way: like if you got a circle of nodes, and all of each node around this circle is connected to the one next to each other, you can calculate the average distance between two randomly chosen nodes around this circle. And let's say it's like, 10 or something. Well, if you put even one connection across the whole circle to combine or, to connect two nodes from across the circle, the average like path connection of the whole network is like cut in third or something.
Right.
It's like a massive
significant decrease
multiplier. And so I think that's a main point of the VMPFC, and then specifically we get to a neuron called the von Economo neurons, is that these long range connections to different parts of the brain kind of increase the small world architecture of our brains and allowed us to become more efficient and connect our emotions to our logic in a really hyper new way.
It is like a big theme of this is he's like trying to piece it together, all the different parts of the brain, but he keeps saying how it's all super connected and it's so complicated and all that. That's kind of cool when you think about it. I know like the AI researchers and everything, it's like, it's not about more computing power. It's about like more different parallel pathways of computing power almost. It's very interesting to think about.
Yeah, the brain is by far the most interesting
Super
thing in the
deep,
universe.
Sweet.
By far.
So cool.
Our boy Sapolsky, he says in the book, he sort of regrets working on the hippocampus instead of the real mastermind.
I would regret that for him, by the way.
Yeah, me
sucks.
too. Me too, yeah. I feel like this
you
book
picked this one region of the brain to research, and that region kind of sucks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's more interesting reasons. So here's a quick and dirty list of some of the cool things the neocortex, our frontal cortex, does to affect our behavior. Working memory, which is like a desktop computer responsible for the desktop of the computer. It's responsible for holding whatever information you're working on right now.
Another thing neocortex does, executive function organizing. It collects information and acts intelligently upon information.
Yeah, that's how you structure your, put on shoes and put on jacket, get in the car to go to the, this takes a lot of logistics, really.
Yeah,
your brain has
structured, organized thought. That's the PFC.
Gratification, postponement, not eating that darn marshmallow when you were in kindergarten.
The neocortex is about long-term planning, not going 100K into debt for medieval history degree. Sorry, that was Sapolsky's shred, okay?
Maybe mine, I don't know. Emotion regulation, laughing at your boss's bad jokes. That's how,
your PFC's doing that. They know,
Yeah.
I should laugh here, right?
Yeah.
And last but certainly not least, impulse control, not trying to solve the problem when your girlfriend just wants you to understand the problem.
Do you think it takes multiple layers of processing to realize okay, this is the social situation. There's just lots of really complex navigating going on.
Dare I say that PFC is kind of the maturation part of the brain a little bit in a way. I mean, it also, we're going to get to it, but it doesn't come online till 25.
Here's the big quote about the prefrontal cortex that he says, quote, "The cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do." So that's a good sum up of if you think about exercising and eating healthy and saying the right thing and laughing at your boss's bad jokes and everything, those are slightly harder to do than the opposite. And so in certain situations, it's the right thing to do. And that's our frontal cortex that helps us do that. So damage to your frontal cortex, you're probably exercising less. You're probably, laughing at your boss's bad jokes less.
and it makes sense also, as I just mentioned, because the frontal cortex is the most recently evolved in terms of human species and human brains, the most recently evolved section, and it really doesn't fully plug into your brain until you're 25 years old.
It doesn't start throwing its causal power around until your early
mid-20s.
Yeah, which is crazy. And that is so we have a chapter on adolescence, and that's the main fact of the chapter on adolescence.
Why teens are so stupid. It's because their PFCs aren't plugged in yet.
Aren't totally plugged in. Okay, and so we talked about these long-range neurons called von Economo neurons or spindle cells that connect distant parts of our brain. Specifically, they connect our insular cortex, I believe, to the prefrontal cortex, or there's some sort of connection there, which makes sense for social situations and norm violations. And interestingly enough, want to know the animals that have these very special kinds of neurons? Very special,
specific neurons, and most recently evolved neuron type that we think the humans have the most of this neuron type. So it's very interesting. We think it makes us smart. And listen to the other animals that have this neuron type, Jay.
Dolphins, whales, elephants, and other apes.
And I think that is super interesting that only those other animals have this von Economo neuron type. And Sapolsky makes a point here, which is super deep to think about. He's von Economo neurons are strong evidence for convergent evolution.
Yeah, when you have an evolutionary need for friendships and long-term relationships and punishing norm violations and having culture and everything like that.
Right, but
only these very special animals have it, which is a good example.
And it's interesting that the different types of animals, all mammals who form some kind of social groups, evolved it separately in their own brains. I mean, that's what's super cool too. So
back to the PFC though. So those von Economo neurons connect the PFC to the insular cortex, responsible for empathy and friendship. But what does the PFC actually do? What does that mean? How does it help us do the harder thing when it's the right thing?
Well, Jay, it helps because the PFC is what organizes, categorizes, and prioritizes information. That's what it does. It also is what helps us avoid grabbing the cookie by, in Sapolsky's words, quote, giving some lone inhibitory motor neuron more of a fighting chance. So we might have a motor neuron saying, don't eat that cookie, but your PFC is listening to that being yeah. We're on a diet right now, right?
That's the
we
neuron
should
that
not do
knows
that.
what it's talking
because
about.
Obviously if it's just your base brain working, like you're gonna eat the cookie. Like that's you're hungry.
But that costs a lot of energy, that extra processing power. So the frontal neurons are more expensive and therefore vulnerable to being shut down. And that's why we say that self-control is a finite resource. You've read about that in like habit books or whatever. If you tire someone's frontal cortex by making them remember lots of stuff, like you give them a 7-digit number or something, they've tested this, like, hey, remember this number for the next 20 minutes and then we're going to make you play an annoying little like math game, but we're not going to check on your score or whatever. People are actually more likely to lie and cheat about their score on this game if they had to like remember something before. Like,
that's crazy.
Yeah, you give them a PFC task that tires them out, and they're just like, screw it.
I'll just lie on this other thing now. It is crazy how much if it's like a gas tank of just brain energy basically. Yeah. So the key to not always tiring your PFC out is to make whatever you learn automatic. You don't pee in your bed anymore. It's automatic. You don't have to think about not doing it. It just happens, right?
You play sport, you play an instrument, like
it's automatic, right?
When you really learn something, that's an extra interesting thing. It's like
you transfer it off the PFC into
we talked about that in some book where like among professionals, activity in their brain regions when they do whatever, maybe play piano or play golf or whatever, their activity is lower than the average person, because for the average person, they're thinking, oh, okay, swing back, chest out, whatever. Where the professional is just,
dude,
takes less processing.
All the, Headspace golf books always tell you, they call it like person 1 and person 2, like, you don't want to be swinging in person 1, thinking about what you're doing to swing. You always want to be person 2, like just a subconscious swing is actually much better. Yeah. Because that's where you're actually like
too many mind.
No mind. Come on. Yes, please.
Here's another interesting point about tidbit about the PFC is that primates with larger group sizes is correlated with having a larger frontal cortex, and also people with more friends have a slightly larger prefrontal cortex. Quote, social complexity expands the frontal cortex. His words, not ours.
Yeah, we quoted that one because it's such a big statement, but it's super interesting and seems to be true in terms of, looking at the group sizes of different animals. It certainly is true.
It's a lot of complexity to navigate, having so many friends and situations. You got to know what to do the right thing. Like, even if your balls itch, you can't scratch them because that's your prefrontal cortex.
Public. Yeah, it might be the right thing, but it's not the right thing in this context, right? Exactly. PFC knows that.
Yeah.
So you gotta, but when you're a little boy, you don't know that yet. So you scratch your balls.
And who wouldn't have known that? All right, let's go back to our boy Phineas Gage. Apparently, this railroad spike that blew out his VMPFC landed 80 feet away. Side note.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
And then we're not going to quote the doctor. It was too long of a quote. But what his doctor who studied him, basically, we're summing up his quote as saying, Phineas used to be a decent dude, and now he's a dick. He's a pervert. He's a psychopath. And he just generally cares Phineas. Less about people. But what happened later in his life?
He got better. Other parts of his brain took over a lot of the responsibilities that were previously run by the PFC that got knocked out by the spike.
Which is,
we call that neuroplasticity. That's when your brain changes as you grow and like different sections do different things. Wow. Cool that he like relearned how to be a good person again. That's super cool.
Yeah. So the book also talks about the DLPFC, which is the super cognitive, like super sharp, kind of the antithesis of the VMPFC, which is plugged into our emotions. The DLPFC is like
he calls it I remember him saying in the book, it's like deliberative PFC, or maybe that's whatever, but you got the deliberative and the emotional parts of your PFC. But
we talked about that in Righteous too. Let's get to an Antonio Damasio quote, because obviously we can't make it through a podcast without quoting this guy.
Damasio, baby.
Well, Damasio thinks that decision making is our PFC running experiments on our limbic circuits. Like, how would it feel emotionally if this situation occurred?
That's super cool.
If I scratch my balls in public, is that a good thing or a bad thing emotionally? And then our intuition pops out an answer of like, people would look at you and think you're crazy, and then we decide whether or not to.
Dude, a PFC running experiments on limbic circuits, that is a really interesting way to think about how your brain works.
Yeah,
it kind of makes sense, because you're kind of like, if I did this, what would happen? How would that make me feel? Oh, good. Okay, probably doing that.
That's why you need that's why emotion and logic are like the same thing basically, because you don't have logic without emotion.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. That's
So-
Elephant and Rider. We crossed off another 2 pages and we skipped like 100 pages of this PFC stuff, Jay.
So let's
we're
do the
PFC'd
inside,
out, so
yeah.
we're gonna sum it out. So
Frontal cortex makes you do the right thing when it's the harder thing to do.
Bang.
Inside your social group, that often relies on your VMPFC for the, social niceties. But here's an interesting point, is that outside your social group, just with like normal day-to-day interactions with the cashier or whatever, you're mostly going to rely on your cognitive DLPFC, which is kind of interesting. It makes sense. We're not going to dig into that, but it just kind of, seems to make sense.
So that is a big chunk on the 3 parts of the brain that we wrapped up. So what were they? Amygdala, insular cortex, and PFC.
No, but we're getting to the third part, the dopamine system, because
that's the whole third part is the dopamine system. Okay.
Where does our frontal cortex get the motivation to do the harder thing? Like why does it decide? That comes from the dopamine system.
Interesting.
We're going to do a whole book on dopamine called The Molecule of More. Loved it. Read it like 4 or 5 times.
Because dopamine is so interesting. And there's so many uses for it. But right now, we're going to focus on the most important, simplistic use of dopamine. Dopamine is the reward feeling. It's what you get in your brain when you are excited, when you did something and you get a reward from your brain.
And it's a little more complicated than just reward, but that scientists used to think it was just the pleasure molecule. You may have heard that because, look at the studies. If you eat food, basically every single animal on planet Earth is going to release dopamine when they eat food.
Having sex releases dopamine in every single animal.
Basically every single animal.
Yeah. People even release dopamine when they think about having sex. And human men and rhesus monkeys will, no joke, forgo drinking even if they're thirsty to look at their respective species porn.
Must be clarified though. The
respective species only, yeah, for
sure. It doesn't work for rhesus porn on it. Dopamine even responds to aesthetics, like listen to some great music, maybe for some people checking out a good sports car, boom, dopamine. It's that pleasure of something more. It's kind of a beyond sort of feeling. We talk much more about that in the Molecule of More. You know what else is satisfying?
And super dopamine releasing. That would be punishing norm violations.
Great.
Oh, yeah, if someone in your group does something weird, it feels so good to tell them that that's weird and don't do that, or saying or punishment for something for not doing it.
Yeah,
right?
Some guy cuts you off and then wants to get over into someone else, and somebody blocks it. It feels great.
Yeah. So that's how we build civilizations, guys. That dopamine chemical is out there, organizing our civilizations for us. Thanks, dopamine.
Here's a good example, a good study that drills down on what dopamine really does. Okay, you're a monkey.
Yeah, how dopamine works proportionally.
You're pushing a lever and a raisin pops out. Awesome. Love raisins. Dopamine.
Love it.
Now you press the lever again. 2 raisins pop out. Whoa.
Double the dopamine, dude. You got it.
Double the dopamine. But if you keep getting 2 raisins every press, our dopamine system's going to be like, yeah, that's typical. It's good.
Yeah.
I like it, but it's going to go back to the 1 raisin level. Then suddenly, instead of 2 raisins, you press the lever, you only get 1 raisin. And dopamine actually declines. It generates a negative feeling inside you.
Whoa.
What the hell is happening? I used to get 2 and now I'm only getting 1. There's a word that sums that feeling up: habituation.
Nothing is ever as good as the first time. Your body has to scale your reaction to external
It just
stimuli.
has to work that way. You can't be just as thrilled every time you drink some tasty water, or nothing would ever get done. Your body, it's it was the word I was thinking of yesterday, hedonic treadmill. That's the word.
That's what it is. Yeah.
In order to get us up in the morning, our biology has to be hey, it's never, nothing's ever good at the first time. You need to keep seeking new experiences. You need to keep creating or pursuing new resources.
Right.
You can't just sit on your ass.
And it's crazy that's how it works, but that's how the dopamine works in your system. Yeah. And listen to this. It's so mathematical, interesting how this works. So we're going to do a study. We're going to cover a quick study here. So you have 2 groups of monkeys. One group pulls the lever and gets 2 raisins. Another group pulls the lever and gets 20 raisins. That's the groups. They're going along. They're getting their dopamine. We're measuring the dopamine. If you double the amount of raisins to 4 and 40, respectively for each group, 2 to 4, 20 to 40. Each group has an identical increase in dopamine. It's such a proportional thing, right?
It's proportional. It doesn't matter that one monkey got 20 more. If the reward was doubled, the dopamine was doubled.
That's crazy.
Like, it's all about expectation. That's the main point here, is that dopamine, actually, when you drill down, we used to think it's about the pleasure molecule, but really it's about the anticipation of pleasure. So it doesn't matter 20 or 40 or 2 or 4. It's that, what do you expect, then what happens, and that is the correlated with the amount of reward feeling in your brain.
Wow. And so to sum this up, this dopamine stuff, we're going to hit you with a scary but awesome quote from Sapolsky. Once hunter-gatherers might chance upon honey from a beehive and thus briefly satisfy a hardwired food craving. And now we have hundreds of carefully designed commercial foods that supply a burst of sensation unmatched by some lowly natural food. Once we had lives that, amid considerable privation, also offered numerous subtle and hard-won pleasures. And now we have drugs that cause spasms of pleasure and dopamine release 1,000-fold higher than anything stimulated us in our old drug-free world. And emptiness comes from this combination of over-the-top unnatural sources of reward and the inevitability of habituation. Damn, dude. Yeah. Soon we barely notice the fleeting whispers of pleasure caused by leaves in autumn, or by the lingering glance of the right person, or the promise of reward following a difficult, worthy task. If we were designed by engineers, as we consume more, we desire less. But our frequent human tragedy is the more we consume, the hungrier we get. Ooh. And here's a creme de la creme quote, just wrapping it all up. Quote, what was an unexpected pleasure yesterday is what we feel entitled to today, and what won't be enough tomorrow. Damn, dude. Yeah, Sapolsky just shredding how our brain works right now.
Dopamine evolved to reward us for maximizing resource acquisition. And why would we waste time on being happy with what we already have? That's the thing, that like once you have something, there's no point in feeling good about it. Like,
yes,
it's useless. You have it,
and he kind of
you have to anticipate next
anticipate the next goal. And that's what he kind of gets into, is dopamine is really fueling goal-directed behavior.
Amen.
Quote, dopamine binds the value of a reward to the resulting work.
That's so deep.
Yeah,
binds the value of the reward
to the resulting work to get the reward.
Yeah,
dude, humans got to work. Dopamine's let's make them work. In other words, dopamine is not about the happiness of reward. It's about the happiness of pursuit of reward that has a decent chance of occurring. Here's a jewel of a factoid. You're hungry. You've been working for hours. You smell a fresh baked cookie. Oh my gosh, that smells so good. If you squirt more dopamine at your emotional mammalian limbic brain, you're going to eat the cookie. Scientists have done this. If you squirt the dopamine at your cognitive human frontal cortex, the reward of six-pack in the future is more salient, and you're likely to feel better about not eating the cookie. Dopamine has different effects, right?
Depending on which circuit it's in. There's a limbic, I forget what it's called, but the limbic dopamine circuit and the frontal cortex dopamine circuit, so the dopamine will come out of your ventral tegmentum area, VTA, and then it has two different circuits where one is more responsible for like desire, and one is more responsible for inhibiting some of you want the cookie, but it inhibits your desire for the cookie because there's a future goal that is more salient to that section, as in, maybe a six-pack, or, you have a wedding dress that you want to fit into. Side note here, but people with ADHD, why do they take Adderall? Adderall is a dopamine-releasing thing. You'd think that would make them more even chase whatever, like thought comes into their head. But that dopamine is actually secreted more towards the frontal cortex, which increases their ability to inhibit their desire to just kind of bounce around to a bunch of different ideas, and allows them to stick on one task longer than they would have without it. So that's why Adderall actually works for people with ADHD.
Damn. And here's a dopamine sum-up quote from Sapolsky. Though the dopamine system is similar across numerous species, humans do something utterly novel. We delay gratification for insanely long times. No warthog restricts calories to look good in a bathing suit next summer. No gerbil works hard at school to get good SAT scores, to get into a good college, to get into a good grad school, to get a good job, and to get in a good nursing home. We do something even beyond this unprecedented gratification delay. We use the dopaminergic power of happiness of pursuit to motivate us to work for rewards that come after we're dead. Depending on your culture, this can be knowing that your nation is closer to winning a war because you've sacrificed in a battle, that your kids will inherit money because of your financial sacrifice, or that you will spend eternity in paradise. It is extraordinary neural circuitry that bucks temporal discounting enough to allow some of us to care about the temperature of the planet that our great-grandchildren will inherit. Basically, it's unknown how we humans do this. We may merely be a type of animal, mammal, primate, and ape, but we are a profoundly unique one. That's a great
that was great
dopamine.
So
wow.
that was the sum up of the brain. 3 main
brain
hubs.
section.
Amygdala as the hub of fear, aggression, anxiety, and arousal. The frontal cortex is the hub for behavior planning, regulation, and restraint. And the dopaminergic system as the hub for motivation, depending on whatever thing we're motivated to do. So that was all chapter 2.
Chapter 2, okay.
Yeah. So we're not going to spend that much time on every chapter, but that was just like maybe
what a chapter, dude. It was very good. All that brain stuff was so interesting.
Yeah, it was basically his whole lifetime spent studying the brain, so that was his good sum up. We're actually skipping chapters 3 because he talks about conditioning and priming. Like if you read a bunch of vocab words about old people, that you're going to walk more slowly down the hallway when you leave. Like a lot of those studies aren't replicating super well, so we're skipping that chapter. On to chapter 4, which would be what happened to influence your behavior hours to days before the behavior occurred.
And that realm, the realm of chapter 4, hours to days before the behavior, that's the realm of hormones. Hormones affect your behavior on the hours to days timescale. Our main focus is on the big 3 hormones: testosterone, oxytocin, and cortisol. So, and just a quick pause here, Jay, before we get into chapter 4, but you just mentioned Ian about how he's talking about different studies. Every line in this book is like some scientist's life's work of their study. And Sapolsky has read every study done by every scientist, and like all you get in his book is like one line for your
pure details of studies.
Exactly, that's all it is. So it's like
pyramid of like.
We're so thankful that some guy knows every study and wrote a book summarizing them all. You know what I mean?
And hilarious.
A hilarious book summarizing them all. But
you can only be that funny if you spent your whole career studying baboons, basically.
Baboons by yourself in Africa.
By yourself. This guy is so weird. He has such a great perspective.
And so this chapter is basically the summary of all of the key studies around testosterone, oxytocin, and cortisol, and how those studies affect how humans behave.
So you may be wondering, like us, before we read this, like what is the difference between dopamine and testosterone and like neurotransmitters and hormones, and what are they? So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and what that means is that it has an instantaneous and hyper-local effect. Like it's one neuron, and it shuffles some dopamine molecules over a nanometer to the next neuron right next door. Like it only affects something right next door. That's a neurotransmitter, where hormones are just dumped into the bloodstream
sloshing
from whenever.
Around.
They're just sloshing around, and they travel all over the place, binding to all sorts of places, and they operate on the time scale of hours and days, where neurotransmitters are like milliseconds.
Hormones are bigger, sloppier, and move more slowly, like we said, sloshing around your body in the bloodstream. And here's a juicily contrarian summary of this chapter here. Testosterone isn't all about aggression like we think it is. Oxytocin isn't all about free love like we think it is. Cortisol, which comes from stress, is like smoking level bad for your body. So that's kind of like if you had 3 bullet points to sum up the chapter, that's what he's talking about.
We'll say that we do want a little bit of cortisol, but yeah, too much chronic cortisol is like horrendously bad. But
so let's start with testosterone, and we're going to start with some context, and we're going to look at the data as any good scientist would do. In most species, males are responsible for the lion's share of aggression, and males have the lion's share of the testosterone. Aggression is also highest when testosterone is highest, aka adolescence or mating season for those people with aggression. So what if you castrate a male? Well, castrating lowers their testosterone and lowers their aggression. What if you inject testosterone back into the castrated guy? It increases his aggression. So the first blush, testosterone and aggression. That's pretty easy to tell, but
it's in the bag.
That's not the story. For castrated males, some aggression remains, so testosterone can't be entirely responsible. And here's the thing. The males who had more experience being aggressive before castration are the ones still being aggressive after they got cut out of testosterone. Cut out was a tough language. Ouchie, bro. Okay. So it's more about social learning. The reason aggressive males have more testosterone is because they secrete testosterone when they're being aggressive.
So it's almost like chicken or the egg, like maybe testosterone is correlated with aggression because we secrete testosterone when we're being aggressive. Who can say that the testosterone is causing the aggression? So let's look at some effects of testosterone on humans. Here's just a little bullet point list. 1, you're worse at reading emotions when you have higher testosterone than normal. You're less emotionally empathetic. Strangers' faces would activate your amygdala even more than normal. It will increase your confidence and your optimism. It will decrease fear and anxiety. And this could be why if you win a contest, you secrete more testosterone and it makes you more likely to enter and win more contests. Quote, success in everything from athletics to chess to the stock market boosts testosterone levels.
Sounds great, but he says it makes people overconfident and overly optimistic, testosterone does. I.e., in a tough task where you had to work hard with someone, testosterone made you ignore your partner because, duh, you're smarter and obviously right. Overconfident, over-optimistic. Testosterone can make people cocky, egocentric, and narcissistic. It boosts impulsivity and risk-taking, quote, making people do the easier thing when it's the dumbass thing to do.
It sounds like it cuts the prefrontal cortex out.
It inhibits your prefrontal cortex's connection to your amygdala, so you don't think things through and you're not as scared as you otherwise would be, right? So being fearless, overconfident, and delusionally optimistic, sure, that feels good, but rats will work to inject more testosterone. If you let rats inject testosterone, they want it.
They want testosterone. It feels good.
Feels good. Wow, that's crazy.
But this is a great one. It can make you risk it all to invade a territory or to make a peace offer. Like, it amplifies a behavior. It's not correlated with exactly what we do. Like in a certain context, if you gain more status by making a peace offer, that's what you're going to do.
Testosterone is amplifying
whatever,
not just being aggressive all the time.
It helps us do whatever it takes to gain status in a situation. Testosterone will increase our likelihood to do that, and that a lot of times that's not fighting. There's the disconnect between testosterone and aggression.
Watching testosterone and its effect on baboons, as I'm sure he did playing in Africa. This guy, just to give you a sense, by the way, Jay, quick on primates memoir, he would look at baboons' behavior and then they would exhibit some interesting behavior. Boom, he would shoot them with a dart in the neck and then take measurements of their hormones in their body. That's what he did.
And then study
for 30 years and then study
which ones
time.
in different levels of the hierarchy. Like the alpha male has these glucocorticoid levels, the number 2 and the number 3 guy, this level of testosterone. So here is an interesting study. I don't know if this is him, but somebody took a middle ranked monkey in a troop, say the number 3 guy, and if they shoot him up with testosterone, what happens? Wouldn't it make sense that he would be more aggressive?
He'd start fighting with the 1 and 2 because he's number 3.
No, he does not become more aggressive.
Oh, he doesn't do that
because he knows that that's a losing battle. He's going to be an even bigger dickhole to numbers 4 and 5 in the troop because it's basically amplifying the things that he would already normally do.
Dude,
that's the thing. It's like, it doesn't just make him more aggressive. It makes him more aggressive in certain contexts where it will benefit him to be aggressive. Like, it raises his status a little bit if he's a jerk to numbers 4 and 5, but it would lower his status if he was a jerk to 1 and 2.
Wow. Interesting how it works. Also, as an older brother, I approve his behavior. That's so funny.
Because competition is what raises hormone. But even for us, here's the interesting part.
Competition raises levels of testosterone when you're competing.
You don't even have to be the one physically competing.
Which means that it's less about using our muscles than the psychology of dominance and self-esteem that is the one that's getting our testosterone going. That's what testosterone does. I can watch Michigan football and get my testosterone pumping just watching it on TV.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
And here's a good way. Depending on your species, if you get a testosterone boost, you may want to, 1, challenge the guy next to you, 2, fly 1,000 miles south, or 3, you might get awkward around cute girls. It's all about the context
of the behavior.
Yeah.
And testosterone isn't just about dominating and winning all the time. It occasionally encourages pro-sociality, just like dopamine. When it helps you get something like status, you could also be doing pro-social things fueled on testosterone.
In the right setting, it's going to make you do the right thing if that's what gets you status.
It was noticed that testosterone can actually make some people more generous in certain experiments. So testosterone, again, it's not about aggression. It's not all bad. Testosterone, there's a range. It's context.
So you know what's not all good is he says oxytocin.
Oxytocin.
So who doesn't love the tocin? These are called neuropeptides, apparently. I don't know anything about that, but oxytocin, he throws it in with another one called vasopressin. We're just going to oversimplify and call all of these stuff oxytocin. And what's a good activity associated with oxytocin?
Dude, pillow talk.
Pillow talk. Who doesn't love pillow talk?
That's when your oxytocin is really pumping.
Yeah,
it's like,
but
snuggling, all that.
Apparently, oxytocin's real purpose was preparing a female for birth. Pretty different, but again, evolution just co-ops everything.
Here's just a quick one. If you inject oxytocin into a rat, that female rat will groom and lick everything around her. If you block oxytocin in the female rat, she won't even lick her own kids. Males in monogamous species have higher levels of oxytocin. That's really the bottom line. Couples who touch more have higher oxytocin. So that's just some ways that oxytocin data shows us how it acts in our brain, right?
Here's a great experiment. Squirt some oxytocin up a happily married guy's nose, and he will actually stand further away from an attractive researcher of the opposite sex.
Jay, but what happens if you squirt oxytocin up a single guy's nose?
This was a great little factoid. Yeah. He's like, there was no correlation between how much oxytocin they got and how close they stand to the attractive researcher, because they were already standing as close as they could possibly get.
They couldn't get closer. Yeah, important finding right there.
What else does it do? It helps parents connect with their kids. That one seems pretty obvious. But here's an interesting one.
Yeah,
it helps you
species oxytocin.
Connect to your dog. If you gaze into your dog's eyes, both of you start releasing oxytocin, which I think is a good, because some people, dogs are so emotional. It's amazing that they actually do love us, and we're actually measuring their ability to love us just like we love them.
Oxytocin shoots in both our brains when we're having a loving moment. So this all sounds great, Jay. Like, this is all good things what we would say are good. It could be good, bad, whatever, but that's good stuff. Why isn't oxytocin the best?
Let's get to an economic game. Say you're, something about sharing money. There's some sort of game, when you get an oxytocin spritz up your nose, you are actually going to be more generous with your teammates, which sounds nice, but here's the kicker: not if your teammates are anonymous.
Whoa!
If you're a them, that's bad, and oxytocin will make you less generous with thems. You give less, you are more jealous when you win, you gloat more when they lose. So here's the main point about oxytocin, is that it's not exactly the free love molecule, it's the in-group love molecule.
Bang!
It's tough stuff for out-groups.
Yeah, you don't get any oxytocin.
It makes you more xenophobic, it makes you less likely to help people that you don't know about, more likely to help people that you do know about. Closes that circle.
That's very interesting. Oxytocin is the in-group love chemical, which is so interesting. And what a great study to talk about oxytocin, and a study that you can't talk about the brain and not talk about the good old trolley probably. You guys have heard it. Do you flip the switch to kill 1 or kill 5, that kind of thing. Well, there was a study where they did the trolley problem with Dutch people.
Yep, in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, and they gave the trolley riders, or the people that were going to die, names.
They took the one person that you could, the train is going to hit Dirk. Good Dutch name, right?
Pim, another good Dutch name.
Yeah, we know a Pim. Okay, it's going to hit Pim. Poor Pim. Pim, I've got a buddy named Pim. I got to say Pim. So I redirect the track towards the 5 anonymous names. Or
the one name is the name that I like.
Yeah, Pim. And that's if they were given a spritz of oxytocin, they're more likely to save their buddy Dirk and more likely to kill the 5 unnamed people. But what if that name of the one person that the trolley is going to hit is something like, this is dark. Sapolsky gets dark. What if that guy's name is Muhammad or Abdul? Well, there are them.
We're not going to throw the trolley there. Yeah. We're going to probably not save them in the trolley this time.
With a spritz of oxytocin, they're actually less likely to flip the switch. Again, this is all just random
asking
hypothetical
people questions. No, there's no actual switches.
But still, it's really that's great to think about.
And that's he does get super dark,
super dark.
His stance is basically human nature's pretty nasty.
Pretty nasty.
Like implicit bias. We our amygdala fires when we see different race faces. Yeah. We kill people with different race names. Said at the beginning.
It's this book is about violence and aggression and cooperation.
throughout the book, he's talking about there's ways we can change, there's ways we can be better, there's examples of us growing and becoming better. So he's like, still we can go in the right way, but man, we have a long way to go.
Okay, so there was the sum up on oxytocin. Now we're bringing it to Sapolsky's field of study, that stress hormones, especially cortisol. That's what, when he was bowing down, or what, air blowing, air gun?
Air darting around.
Air darting the baboons.
Dude, that's what he's doing. He has a whole chapter on like how to air dart a baboon or whatever. So.
And he had, what his best line of that whole book is, he's like, basically, I spent a lot of time looking nonchalant around. You know, you have to look like you're pretty chill, and you can't look at the baboons too closely. He's like, it's harder than you think, even with a PhD. That was such a great line. So here's the bottom line on stress and cortisol, is that chronic stress is like smoking level
bad. Oh yeah. So,
and we are weird because we're the only animal that can think about things and give us stress from our own thoughts. But to flip things around, here's some good stuff about good stress, that we love being challenged and engaged. Like, that's why we play chess. That's why we play golf or play piano, because these things arouse us a little bit, and that teeny little bit of cortisol is actually pleasurable. So there's kind of like a Buddhist middle path of cortisol that we like, because it increases brain growth and increases connections in your learning centers. That little squirt of cortisol, of a little challenge.
And an interesting one here, rats will actually do work to give themselves just the right amount of cortisol. So rats, there's like a balance of a little bit of stress that you want, not too much, not too little. Like most things, that Buddhist middle path of cortisol is the right answer.
The Buddha nailed it with that middle path.
Too much cortisol and those chemicals limit the activation of your cognitive PFC. AKA you act more emotionally and probably more irrationally.
Like you're not gonna have that plug-in of like, wait a second, that bell doesn't necessarily mean the shock anymore. You know, if the more stress you feel, the more shut out of of that conversation your cognitive PFC is.
And even more so, stress will connect your scaredy cat amygdala to your memory hippocampus.
That's what we're saying. Like, it cuts out other things, and so that increases the interaction.
And remember being scared, and now you're going to be scared next time, and your amygdala is going to fire faster because it's still scared. Oh, it's bad.
So here's the quote. Stress strengthens this recruitment, making the hippocampus a temporary fear-laden suburb of the amygdala. Thanks to these glucocorticoid actions in the amygdala, stress makes it easier to learn a fear association and to consolidate it into long-term memory.
Have you guys ever seen scared people repeat the same behaviors over and over again? They just get in like this loop of scared and they don't know what to do. They can't get out of it. Yeah, that's your cognitive PFC going offline, so it can't shut down the amygdala. So the amygdala has learned to be scared of something and can't take in new information, and we have this recurring feedback loop between the amygdala and the hippocampus just going nonstop.
Fear-laden suburb.
Fear-laden suburb.
Great writing.
I love that, yeah.
So how do we reduce stress to the right optimal levels? We know the normal ways, like running, relaxing, warm bath, sex, meditation. But here's an interesting part, and this is the main thing that he studied out in the baboons, is that we take our stress out on other people, which unfortunately feels great.
Quote, among baboons, for example, nearly half of aggression is this type. A high-ranking male loses a fight and chases a subadult male who promptly bites a female who then lunges at an infant. My research shows that within the same dominance rank, the more a baboon tends to displace aggression after losing a fight, the lower his glucocorticoid level.
How depressing is that? Like, it's a good thing biologically for us to be assholes to our neighbors.
Assholes to the people lowest on the dominance hierarchy. Yeah. The ones that are going to stay below. That's weird. That is so weird.
And get this. If your football team loses...
True story. This is a study.
Violence against wives and girlfriends in an area increased by 10%.
That's so crazy. That's so sad. It's crazy. It's fat. Like, wow.
But here's like the double crazy. That the violence increases even more if your team was in the playoffs. Like, these things, think about
I'm only laughing because it's so crazy. It's just like, it's so sad, you know?
It makes so much sense though. Like,
it does.
But what's interesting is like our brains are taking the concept of playoffs, and that concept of playoff trickles all the way down into our biology and our anger and our testosterone and all of these things. Like, they all, like, they're the causal chain is so complicated.
And like the symbolism of like kangaroos don't have playoffs. Like we have
Nobody
this
else has
symbolism of
playoffs.
playoffs, but it still affects like some basic stress hormones in our body.
Imagine
and which
realities of
causes
sapiens.
violence against wives and girlfriends to go up based on the playoff.
Okay. In sum,
Okay, summing it up.
hormones are important, obviously, affect our behavior on the hours to days time scale. Here's testosterone. Doesn't necessarily make us more aggressive. Quote, it increases whatever is needed to maintain status. In a world in which status is awarded for the best of our behaviors, testosterone would be the most pro-social hormone in existence. That's a good one. That makes me think of the manosphere, all the pickup guys who make a high priority to be high T while also being very chivalrous, tipping well, dressing well, being good people, like that high testosterone in the right environment makes us want to be a very pro-social person if that's what the females want.
Yep. And now get into oxytocin and vasopressin.
Oh, are you talking about neuropeptides?
Neuropeptides there, Jay. Yep. They help us pair bond and infant bond. They reduce stress, enhance trust to make us more cooperative and xenophobic, by the way, because the good stuff only counts towards us's, not them's. Like that's oxytocin is in-group love. We talked about that. And now the third hormone, cortisol, and its effect on our body, which is creating stress. It's usually bad, but sometimes it's good. Too much stress, too much cortisol leads to habitual behavior, poor decision-making. Quote, hormones don't determine, command, cause, or invent behaviors. Instead, they make us more sensitive to the social triggers of emotionally laden behaviors and exaggerate our pre-existing tendencies in those domains. And where do those pre-existing tendencies come from? From the contents of the chapters ahead of us. What a transition.
Yeah, okay.
Unbelievable.
So the nervous system was like fractions of a second before the behavior. That we skipped over sensory cues, which was minutes before. We talked about hormones, which is like hours before. And now we're on to chapter 5, days to months before. Like, how does our brain actually change over time? Like, how are you going to remember this podcast? We are
Something in your brain has to change.
Rewiring your brain right now.
Rewiring.
Certain branches are strengthening, synapses are being trimmed, others are, connecting to other neurons. That is how it works. Side note, we have 86 billion. That's the number now.
Neurons in our brain, which is oddly close to the number of stars in the galaxy. Boom on that one.
Yeah.
Side note.
Weird side note.
And here's a quick little tidbit about how brains change over time. Blind people can read Braille using their visual cortex that's no longer in use because their eyes don't work anymore.
All that processing power is being used for the touch.
So if you had sight and then you lost it, your visual part of your brain will now be your Braille reading part of your brain. That's pretty cool. That's an example of changing your brain that's called neuroplasticity.
Anecdote, but good one, that a blind lady had a stroke in her visual area and lost the ability to read Braille.
Whoa.
So that's interesting.
And actually, if you scan musicians' brains, you can tell they're a musician because the auditory cortex in a musician brain is bigger. If you start playing an instrument, your auditory and hand movement parts grow a little bit together. Your brain is like a record of your life as you do stuff.
And the big sum up, like it's really interesting to think about, some like super intelligence could dissect our brain and kind of figure out what we were up to a little bit. That's kind of
cool to say.
Thought experiment.
That might be a little more sci-fi movie out there, but yeah, that's cool to think about.
So this doesn't seem like as big of a deal now, but it used to be in science. People thought there were no new neurons that grew, that there were no new connections made. So the fact the neuroplasticity becoming such a big thing was a really big deal over the last decades or so. So here we're taking a bunch of nucleotides, which actually was the first correction that we've ever had on this podcast, because amino acids apparently make proteins and nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA. Okay.
Thank you, Carol and Alessandra.
So how do we know that neuroplasticity exists? Like, what was the studies done that confirmed it? That's what we're getting into here now. If we take a bunch of nucleotides, so those are the ones that are going to build our DNA, and we mix those nucleotides with some radioactive material that we're able to see, and then we inject that into the brain, some neurons were grown over the course of the experiment and incorporated those radioactive nucleotides. And so they gave them some tests. Maybe they had to learn some movement pattern that grew some part of their motor cortex. And we actually saw those radioactive nucleotides incorporated into those aspects of the brain, proving definitively that there was neuroplasticity going on, that our brain was building new connections.
Dude, all you Brother Books listeners, you got to thank JD for diving in to describe how they measure neuroplasticity. Only JD brings that to the table. One thing about reading all these books written by scientists is they really are great at shredding each other, absolutely destroying each other when they need to. Scientific trash talk is some of the best because it's like career level trash talk. Yeah. They're like trashing some guy's entire field of study for his life.
They're representing institutions. And so apparently the guy who is coming up with those experiments, the radioactive nucleotides, well, he was in New Mexico. And the guys that he was arguing against, the big head honchos, were at Yale. And so what did he say when he saw that study?
He said, those may look like new neurons in New Mexico, but they don't in New Haven.
Ooh. Not over here, they're not.
Yeah, those Yale guys, so annoying. So if you're writing a movie about this plucky scientist overturning everything we thought we knew, you can't write a better line than that. That's what we say.
Yeah.
So, love that scientific trash talk.
So here's a quote that's too good not to include. The guy who proved neuroplasticity was super old when he was finally vindicated, like 30 years later. People were like...
All the Yale guys were like, fuck you, that's not true, blah, blah, blah. Your brain doesn't change. And he's like, yes, it does. And then bang.
Like they say, science changes one funeral at a time.
Oh, ouch, dude.
And so the guy who was proven correctly right before his death, they said, oh, how do you feel now that everybody thinks your studies were so groundbreaking? And Sapolsky says, quote, he's philosophical about it. Hey, I'm a Hungarian Jew who escaped from a Nazi camp. You take things in stride after that.
Oh my gosh, dude. What a guy. What a guy.
Maybe he read Man's Search for Meaning.
I bet he did.
That sounds like a Man's Search for Meaning.
So that's a quick sum up on how neuroplasticity can affect your behavior. Your brain slowly changes over time as you experience the world. Every day, every experience affects your brain, and it affects the way your brain is going to behave in the future.
That's how it has to be. Like your brain is constantly taking in information, acting on it, and coding it into your brain, building memories. So that was days to months before the behavior. And now we're going to talk about things that affected our behavior that occurred years before the behavior. The best chapter title of all time, Chapter 6.
Adolescence, or Dude, Where's My Frontal Cortex? That's what he's talking about here. And that's the sum up of the chapter right there.
Dude, where's
the frontal cortex in adolescence, right?
The importance of the frontal cortex is the main point of this chapter, and how it doesn't start throwing its weight around until our 20s. So here's a quote that I'm going to read slow, but it's so good. Big paragraph here. I bet you've never thought about adolescence like this before. This is one of my favorite quotes of the book, by the way. I think about this all the time, actually. Okay, here we go. Quote. Nothing about adolescence can be understood outside the context of delayed frontocortical maturation. If by adolescence, limbic, autonomic, and endocrine systems are going full blast while the frontal cortex is still working out the assembly instructions, we've just explained why adolescence is the time when a person is most likely to, great list coming, most likely to kill, be killed, leave home forever, invent an art form, help overthrow a dictator, ethnically cleanse a village, devote themselves to the needy, become addicted, marry outside their group, transform physics, have hideous fashion taste, break their neck recreationally, commit their life to God, or mug an old lady.
In other words, adolescence is the time of maximal risk-taking, novelty-seeking, and affiliation with peers, all because of the immature prefrontal cortex.
Great list.
That's such a good list and a good quote, and like a way to sum up how it affects everything that we do.
Inventing art forms, overthrowing dictators. These are all things that people with only semi-plugged in frontal cortexes are capable of. Like everybody with the normal processing is like, I am not wasting my time, joining the Marx and Engels and their crazy ideas of the communist overthrow. Like only 20-year-olds do those things. And when you look at the news, like every crazy bit of every shooter, every the terrorists at 9/11, all these people like storming police precincts and whatever, they're all in their 20s. Like they're all the dumb idiots that have delayed frontocortical maturation. All the people, like all the rappers, that's why they're all lil this, lil that. It's about the frontal cortex.
I love that. You throw the little lil in there, little frontal cortex.
So here's the nuts and bolts of frontocortical maturation. The number one reason for all that behavior is delayed frontocortical maturation. That is the main point of adolescence. Right under your forehead, the most recently evolved part, the part that's by far the biggest in humans, and then still proportionally by far the largest in primates in general, doesn't fully log on until our mid-20s. Why? So that we get to that point that it's more environmentally affected. Like, it delays in maturation so that it learns the most about its environment.
That's crazy. And what you'd think, though, is, okay, we keep saying that your PFC doesn't plug in until you're 25, so you'd think that that means that you have to grow more neurons to plug into your PFC. That's actually opposite of what really happens in your brain. What actually is happening is the brain needs to trim down its connections to improve the flow to and from the PFC.
It's kind of like what we're talking about with the pro athletes and musicians, where actually they exhibit less activity in their motor cortex whenever they're doing their activity because it's so efficient. So actually, like, babies have more neurons than we do. Everything has to get trimmed towards, like, proper efficiency levels.
With connections, it's about quality over quantity. Quote, during late fetal development, there is dramatic competition in much of the brain, with winning neurons being the ones that migrate to the correct location and maximize synaptic connections to other neurons. And neurons that don't make the grade, they undergo pre-programmed cell death. Genes are activated that cause them to shrivel and die. Their materials then recycled. Neuronal overproduction followed by competitive pruning, which has been termed neural Darwinism, allowed the evolution of more optimized neural circuitry, a case of less being more.
Yeah, neural Darwinism. Yeah, it's a great term.
And a crucial deet right here, the supercognitive PFC doesn't start simplifying until late adolescence.
There it is.
So what does that tell us? It tells us that the supercognitive PFC is environmentally crafted. So there you go in that nature nurture. We got a little nurture coming in here a little bit.
It's built into our human behavior code that our rationality is the most environmentally influenced. It picks up on life experience, like we have to adjust everything based on our life experiences. And big surprise here, estrogen and testosterone cut that free prefrontal cortex out of the decision making. Quote, in general, these behavior improvements are accompanied by increasing activity in frontal regions during tasks, with the extent of the increase predicting accuracy.
So let's say you did terribly on an exam. There's a part of you that will say, I'm stupid. There's a more adult part that says, hey, I was sick this week. It was situational, not conditional, that I did poorly on that exam. That's your frontal cortex talking, and that's why teens suck at reappraising things.
Yeah,
you gotta reappraise. That's a part of learning and growing up.
Teens are just less capable of reappraising because they don't have that.
That's crazy.
They have, repeat after me, delayed frontal cortical maturation.
And this is such an interesting study highlighting what delayed frontal cortical maturation looks like.
Great anecdote.
Yeah, it's not a study, it's just a fact.
Yeah.
There's a cave in California that's super long and dark. It's absolutely pitch black in there. And then, like, you walk way into the pitch black, and at the very end, there's a 180-foot drop into a deep hole. So if you walk over the edge of that, you're dead.
Who's walking over the edge?
What skeletons are at the bottom? Okay, what skeletons are at the bottom?
It's kids.
Kids' skeletons. That's terrible.
No grandmas and grandpas are exploring like 1,000 feet into this cave. It takes a delayed frontocortical cortex to be able to walk through the dark.
Because climbing into a dark cave is a good example of novelty seeking.
Novelty.
Right? Let's talk about that for a second. High schoolers are the ones pushing new fashion, new music forward.
New music, new sports, new cultures, new terms.
At the time, the important thing is to be different than what came before. And because Sapolsky studied baboons for 18 years, he relates this to baboons leaving their home troop for another. So think of how hard that would be, leaving all the people you know for a whole nother troop. But that young little baboon leaves willingly. Quote, he wasn't pushed out. Instead, if he has to spend one more day with the same monotonous baboons he's known his whole life, he's going to scream. We primates aren't driven out of adolescence. Instead, we desperately crave novelty.
And then he talks about peer pressure, but we're going to skip some of the peer pressure because it's getting too complex. So we're only going to hit one aspect of peer pressure, that bad behaviors are more contagious than good behaviors. So think about this. Which roommate would influence your behavior more? A roommate who never ever drank or a roommate who drank to party all the time? Quote, the incidence of eating disorders in adolescence spreads among peers with a pattern resembling viral contagion.
Here's another one. Ask an adult what they think about themselves, then ask them how other people think about them. Two different parts of the brain light up, and the adult gives you two different answers. But when you're a kid, there's only one answer. It's how I think about me is how other people think about me.
Yeah.
That's very interesting how that changes as you grow up. You start to understand that other people have different viewpoints from your own.
This is a great quote on violence. As has been said, the greatest crime fighting tool is a 30th birthday.
Ooh, hello. Enough said. But he does make a super interesting point. Quote, on a certain level, the biology underlying the teenaged mugger is similar to that of the teen who joins the ecology club and donates his allowances to help save the mountain gorillas. It's the usual heightened emotional intensity, craving for peer approval, and novelty seeking that drives both behavior. So even though the actual outcome, the actual behavior itself is so drastically different, the influences and the juices in your body flowing towards that behavior are almost identical.
And that was a great little autobiographical point there,
because that was definitely him.
He was definitely donating his allowance to save the mountain gorillas. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up on adolescence. It's all about delayed frontocortical maturation. Why is there delayed frontocortical maturation? Quote, if the frontal cortex matured as fast as the rest of the brain, there'd be none of the adolescent turbulence, none of that antsy, itchy exploration and creativity. None of the long line of pimply adolescent geniuses who dropped out of school and worked away in their garages to invent fire, cave painting, and the wheel. Here's another quote. For example, what makes for a successful baboon in his dominance hierarchy? Attaining high rank is about muscles, sharp canines, well-timed aggression. But once high status is achieved, maintaining is all about social smarts, knowing which coalitions to form, how to intimidate a rival, having sufficient impulse control to ignore most provocations, and to keep displacement aggression to a reasonable level. As noted in Chapter 2, among male rhesus monkeys, a large prefrontal cortex goes hand in hand with social dominance. That's why, you can get socially dominant young males, but they're not going to be there for very long because they don't have the ability to maintain their rank, which takes so much more social intelligence that hasn't fully plugged in yet.
That's super interesting. And another little interesting fact about the prefrontal cortex, because it is the last to mature, by definition, the PFC is the brain region least constrained by genes and most sculpted by experience. And this is a central theme of this chapter. It's the thing most shaped by the environment. Yeah, that piece of the brain.
The later something forms, the more it's shaped by the environment.
Yep. Cheers. Next chapter, we're going back further than adolescence, back to the crib, back to the womb. Now we're talking about how our behavior is affected on the timescale of years. And a quick note while we get into this chapter, you may think we're covering everything because this is the longest podcast we've ever done on a single book. We're only getting to 1/10, and we just wrote it in here just to remind you guys there's so much more that we have to skip because literally every page is so good of this book.
This book is way too good, but we're starting this chapter off with the importance of mothers.
Bang.
There's a famous study where this total asshole, Harlow, we talked about him in The Righteous Mind too, raised baby monkeys without their mothers, took them away from their mothers when they were young, put them in a little enclosure that had two dummy mothers. One was covered in fur, looked like a monkey. The other one was made of chicken wire, the shape of a monkey, but that chicken wire monkey had milk in its breast, like it had a little bottle there. And which dummy mother do you think that monkey clung to? Read that quote.
He says, Sapolsky says, past behavior scientists like Freud and B.F. Skinner would have wrestled over access to chicken wire mom, but infant monkeys chose the terry cloth mom. End of story. And his quote is, man cannot live by milk alone. Love is an emotion that does not need to be bottle or spoon fed.
And Harlow completely ruined those monkeys' lives. They had screwed up social lives the rest of their lives. And because if you spend your first months or years in total isolation, you have no idea how to act among your group. And here's the interesting thing is that they can still do a lot of the monkey things that that you normally think of, like there's behaviors of submission, there's behaviors of dominance, but the weird thing is, quote, behaviors were normal but occurred at the wrong time and place. Say giving subordination gestures to pipsqueaks half their size, threatening alphas they should cower before. Mothers and peers don't teach the motor behaviors of fixed action patterns. Those are hardwired. Moms teach where, when, and to whom the appropriate context for those behaviors.
Super interesting. That's what moms are really doing. That's super interesting.
This means that many behaviors are ingrained in that our mothers show us the context in which that behavior expresses itself.
And then the opposite side of this mother thing is having a shitty childhood really messes you up. So, quote, basically, childhood adversity increases the odds of an adult having the following things, okay? Childhood adversity increases the odds of these. A, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. B, impaired cognitive abilities, particularly related to frontal cortical function. C, impaired impulse control and emotional regulation. D, antisocial behavior, including violence. And E, relationships that replicate the adversities of childhood, e.g. staying with an abusive partner. And despite that, some individuals endure miserable childhoods just fine. More on this to come. But it just shows you how much childhood can screw you up.
So we already learned how chronic stress F's us up. So it's not surprising to learn that chronic childhood stress F's you up for life. And actually, I think in the book, he actually, Control F's childhood adversity.
Yeah, we Controlled F childhood adversity. In one fraction of the book, it comes at 22 times. So he spends a lot of time marinating on it.
No more adverse childhoods.
Yeah, it's very bad. Quote, this is so wrong. Foolishly pick a poor family to be born into, and by kindergarten, the odds of your succeeding at life's marshmallow test are already stacked against you.
Listen to this little footnote. All mammal babies have a period after they're newborn when their ability to generate stress hormones is impaired. It's risky when you think about it that newborns don't get scared, but what's the point? They can't do anything anyways, and mom's got it covered.
Wow.
They need all of the brain plasticity running on full steam, so they can't be having the stress hormones interfering with that brain plasticity. That's why, like, little does, they just hide in the grass and just sit there. And you can come up to them and they're like, what's that? They don't feel that stress.
They're not ready to be stressed yet. Wow.
Because it's not even worth it. If a tiger's coming, the tiger's getting you,
It's not evolutionary worth it.
It's not, it's just, just don't even bother feeling stressed when you can't and do anything about it.
And we talk about babies really detect whether or not they should be stressed based on the facial features of the mother. That's like the mom-baby test. But you're reading your mom's emotions to determine what your emotions should be early on in life.
Of cultural evolution, which is another book, great one called what was it?
Blueprint by Christakis.
Well, Blueprint was a good one, and then there was another one. But we're gonna dig into one interesting distinction. This is a good one.
This is a good one. Yeah.
This is something that we've all kind of experienced. Like you've gone to one friend's house, and their parents, discipline their kids a different way. The overly simplified version is blue collar parenting versus white collar parenting. And actually, there's a study where someone went to poor families in poor neighborhoods in Queens and compared how the parents talk to their kids against upper class parents in Manhattan. And basically, the poorer parents were more authoritarian with their kids. Like, you've got to stay off the street, do what I say, get ahead, all this stuff. Just like, do this, do that. Whereas white collar parents, quote, children's eventual success, by conventional standards, was a given. Far more vulnerable was a child's psychological health. When a child could become anything, parents' responsibility was to facilitate their epic journey towards an individuated fulfillment, such as, quote, I hope my child will never work an unsatisfying job just for money. Here's a good way to explain the difference between blue collar and white collar parenting. Quote, rather than, you kids clean up this mess, there would be an individuated justifying request like, Caitlin, Zach, Dakota, could you clean things up a bit, please? Malala's coming over for dinner. Yeah.
Dude, Sapolsky.
Yeah, such a great
And
writer.
just a side note, Jay, obviously our mom was
so
white collar mom too.
so individuated and justifying, and like, this is the reason for this behavior, or this is the consequence to this, not just like, don't do this, don't do that,
So when evaluating human behavior, moms have a huge effect.
So let's
we're going to even rewind it all the way back to your mom's womb. Hormones in the womb. Womb talk. Hormones in the womb change your brain depending on how much of the hormones there is. Differing levels of sex hormone marinating in our body and our brains lead to sex differences we have for the rest of our lives. We all know that males prefer to play with toy cars and girls like dolls. But did you know that toy cars and girls with dolls, That's true for rhesus monkeys as well. That is crazy, by the way.
Quote, what next? Female monkeys prefer young adult fantasy novels with female protagonists?
So there's all sorts of studies about effect sizes of testosterone and different afflictions that affect hormone development and how that affects adult behaviors, but it's probably a little too much for this podcast.
We
right
probably
here.
just summed up 4 or 5 pages.
I know,
study.
and this sum up of 4 or 5 pages is 4 scientists and 10 scientists in their entire career. So thank you, scientists.
Want another example of childhood affecting adulthood? If you're a rat and your mom is very attentive and licky, that environment will influence your genes to lower stress response to certain stimuli, and you are more likely to be an attentive and licky mother yourself, passing that trait on to your offspring. What's that called? Is there a word for that?
There is. It's called epigenetics. Changes in your gene expression, not your actual genome. And one of the things Sapolsky can finally get excited about in this book is epigenetics. He calls it hugely exciting.
Yeah.
But the main idea there is that your environment doesn't change your genes. It changes which genes are being expressed in your body over time.
It's this crazy causal loop-de-loop between environment and genes, and different genes will program us to be more, have higher propensity or seeking out certain kinds of environments, and certain environments increase propensity for certain genes to be expressed.
So the big sum up of this chapter here goes like this. All sorts of things experienced in childhood affect our adult behavior. Stimulating environments, harsh parents, good neighborhoods, uninspiring teachers, optimal diets, they all alter genes' expression in the brain. Our environment and experience change the excitability of synapses, their number, neuronal circuits, and even the number of neurons. The environment and experience can change the sizes and different parts of the brain. Little in childhood determines exact adult behavior, but everything in childhood changes propensities towards some adult behavior. That's it. That's underline highlight, right?
Propensities.
Boom, boom. Propensities, probabilities, and quote, all that the likes of growth factors, on-off switches, and rates of myelination do is provide insights into the innards of that fact.
That was a good one. Okay.
Chapter on womb talk.
Yeah. Now we're up to chapter 8, back to when we were just a fertilized egg, or how our genetics affects our behavior. So the combination of the sperm and egg, boom, that's our code. Let's talk about genes and everything. Here's a crazy fact. 95% of our DNA doesn't do what DNA is supposed to do, which is build protein. DNA, that's why we think of DNA, builds protein. 95% of it doesn't build protein. Some of it really is worthless. It's called junk DNA. It's DNA that perhaps evolution inactivated. Side note, I love talking about viruses and parasites. A lot of those chunks of DNA are actually, we think, viruses that have kind of fused into our overall genome, and that eventually evolution inactivated. It's like we don't need to print off those parts, but they've just gotten fused in there anyways, which is in fact what herpes is in the process of doing right now. Like eventually 10, 100,000 years from now, maybe just herpes is just part of our DNA.
Whoa,
and
that's wild.
Interesting. Here's a side note of a side note is that actually the gene...
Oh, love this one.
Yeah, the gene that creates a protein that is responsible for the boundary layer between the mother and a placenta. So let's pause on that for a second.
That's a very important boundary layer.
About how important that
It's
boundary
very
layer is.
important. Yes, I agree.
You're already there. Yeah. It's the boundary between one human and another human.
That's pretty cool about barrier.
That protein responsible for that boundary layer comes from a virus. So all mammals are part virus. Isn't that crazy? But at the same time, mitochondria is bacteria, our cells are archaea, maybe the Golgi complex was a different sort of archaea.
Ooh, nice hot topic.
We're really these combinations of all of these things built up, just like this book. It's like a pyramid built of fact after fact. These are all of these combinations of DNA coming together. People don't even think viruses are really alive, and yet mammals are part virus.
Yeah. The thing that separates mom from baby is a virus layer or whatever. That's just so crazy.
Back to the junk DNA. Quote, buried in that junk DNA are the keys to the kingdom, the instruction manual for when to transcribe particular genes, the on-off switches for gene transcription.
So this is complex but interesting here. These proteins called transcription factors float around and turn genes on and off.
So they're little like proteins and they're little on-off switches, and they just float around connecting to certain parts, engaging certain parts, shutting other parts off.
Sapolsky makes a really interesting metaphor here, which I think is super cool. He's like, your genes is kind of like a recipe deciding when to bake itself.
Yeah, how crazy is that?
It's like a recipe to bake itself. That is super cool.
See, that's a very, we talk about that in Gödel, Escher, Bach, which hopefully we'll
recursion,
get to
I'm
at
guessing,
some point.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like recursion and certain part, just like the recipe that contains all of the machinery.
Recipe.
You know, it's like a cake recipe for having a blueprints for how to build an oven, how to build a mixing thing, But what's crazy is it's really about the recipe in a particular environment. That's the key.
It's contextual recipe based on
contextual recipe.
Epigenetic contextual recipes, okay? Wow.
But what's not as crazy is that what regulates the amount of transcription factors floating around is the environment, like we're talking about. So genetic determinism, according to Sapolsky, be damned.
It's crazy learning all of these loops and effects, causes and loops and effects and everything. Childhood to adulthood, which affects our children's childhood, environment regulating genes, environment being shaped by genes, plus genes regulating environments, loops and loops. This is the definition of a complex system. Obviously, human behavior is very complex. That's why this book is so complex.
Quote, consider this. The human genome codes for about 1,500 different transcription factors, contains 4 million transcriptor facting binding sites, and the average cell uses about 200,000 such sites to generate its distinctive gene expression profile.
That's absolutely boggling, Jay. Boggling.
In other words, genes don't determine much.
Great
Not
one
much.
there.
So that was part 1 of the gene chapter.
And part 2 of the gene chapter goes genes from the top down, and now we're going to get into behavior genetics.
Great topic. I've read a bunch of books about this. This is the hot new stuff about how much genes create our personality.
Dude, Brother Books is bringing you the hot new biology. If you can trust Brother Books, we might be slow to come out with a new podcast, but we're going to bring you the hot new behavior genetics, Jay. Go for it.
Genes are our recipes. Obviously, then they affect our personalities. They affect qualities, the big 5, like openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. But less obviously, genes influence our degree of religiosity, attitude towards authority, homosexuality, and even propensities towards cooperation, risk-taking in games. So to sum it up, lots of reports say, this is the kind of, the rough number, about 50% of our personality is directly attributable to mom and dad's genes. Sapolsky happens to think that's inflated, and here's his idea on why. Quote, it's not meaningful to ask what a gene does, just what it does in a particular environment. Deciding if a behavior is attributable to nature or nurture is like saying an area of a rectangle is influenced more by its length than its width. That's a great line.
That is very good. So, Jay, what do genes actually have to do with behaviors that we're interested in?
Well, interestingly enough, there are 7 versions of the gene that builds our dopamine receptors. This is such a great part. And we talk more about this in Molecule of More. But they vary. Those 7 different versions vary on how receptive to dopamine they are. Like maybe you've got the version that's like, it takes a little bit more dopamine to trigger the normal response that in somebody else's version, even a little bit of dopamine would give them the baseline response. So how does that come out? How does that play out in behavior? AKA, the people with the least responsive dopamine receptors crave the most dopamine, have the most novelty seeking. The people with that least receptive dopamine receptor are associated with these traits. Quote, sensation and novelty seeking, extroversion, alcoholism, promiscuity, less sensitive parenting, financial risk taking, impulsivity, and probably most consistently ADHD.
Wow, a gene we can actually see in your genome has these effects on your personality.
Which is crazy.
That's crazy.
Yeah, like the 7 versions, and it just kind of comes out. Like, again, it's not causing behaviors, it's increasing or decreasing propensities.
That's the word of the last couple chapters here. And this one is super interesting about how genes increase propensity for certain behaviors.
Yeah, okay, so
you can map the people of North America based on their genes,
the indigenous people that came over from
Beringer
Siberia.
Strait. Wait, was it the Bering Strait?
Bering
Thank you.
Strait, not Beringer. What is Beringer?
I don't know. Bering Strait.
So there was, it's a bottleneck. You think about all
You
the
gotta go
people
flow
crossing
down
over.
from Alaska. Yep.
Yeah, and depending on how far the people went, is correlated with which variant of the dopamine receptor gene they have. And long story short is that the people who kept going went all the way down to the southern tip of South America, and especially in the Amazon jungle. They have the highest rates of that variant that's least receptive to dopamine, aka they're the ones most highly associated with novelty seeking, extroversion, alcoholism, promiscuity. Like, obviously the people who just kept going and going,
the ones that made it all the way to the southern tip of the South America,
to infinity and beyond.
And there's a great quote here. Quote, "For some people, novelty seeking means frequently switching their openings in chess games, while for others it means looking for a new locale because it's getting stale being a mercenary here in the Congo," right? No gene or handful of genes that we are aware of will tell us much about that. What they're going to tell us is the propensity for wanting novelty seeking.
That was a good point. Like,
that's really cool.
Novelty seeking could mean, overthrowing a dictator or taking a different route to work. Like there's different levels of it, and it just increases the propensity for it. So
you could maybe try out Evan's Gambit one time. Hot one.
So there was the chapter on genes. That was about us being little cells. And so now we're getting outside of the individual and going into an individual's history, or the evolutionary history of all of these moms and dads. Chapter 9, centuries to millennia before the behavior.
How do we get the genes that we have? Moms and dads' cultures created those genes. So here are the goals of the chapter as specified by the Sapolsky right at the beginning. We're going to look at cultural variation at behaviors. We're going to explore how brains build cultures which build brains.
Yeah, think about that. It's once again the causal loop-de-loop. Brains are what build cultures, obviously.
Right.
But then just as obviously,
cultures define what the brains are going to think about and how they act and everything. So let's go. First of all, what is culture? We're going to rewind it back to that. So he hits us with some chimpanzee politics.
Our boy
Franz de Waal, quote, "Culture is how we do and think about things, transmitted by non-genetic means," end quote. That's Franz de Waal defining culture.
Non-genetic means of transmitting how we do and think about things. That was a good one. And so here is a list, just like that adolescent list.
Great list.
This is a list of cultural universals. The next paragraph is just unbelievable because we have never seen a human culture that lacked any of
the following things are in every human culture.
These are human universals. This is just a partial list.
Bang.
Quote, aesthetics, magic, males and females seen as having different natures. Baby talk, gods, induction of altered states, marriage, body adornment, murder, prohibition of some type of murder. Not all types, some's good murder. Kinship, numbers, cooking, private sex, names, dance, play, distinctions between right and wrong, nepotism, prohibitions on certain types of sex, empathy, reciprocity, rituals, concepts of fairness, myths about afterlife, music, color terms, gossip, binary sex, in-group favoritism, language, humor, lying, symbolism, the linguistic concept of and, tools, trade, toilet training, and partial.
That's just a partial list of the things that are in every culture. There's probably way more. You probably cut it out because it just got so long.
There is, I think it's like 100 or something. I think there's a Wikipedia
cultural universals. Blueprint culture talks about like the blueprint of every culture. There's so much interesting on like all cultures are similar in so many ways.
Here's how much cultures differ because
that's how much they're similar, not how much they're different. Yeah.
Someone in Honduras is 450 times more likely to be murdered than someone in Singapore. 65% of women experience intimate partner violence in Central Africa, where in East Asia, only 16%.
In the Philippines, 93% of people say they feel happy and loved, versus 29% of Armenians.
Wow.
So much difference in culture, even though it's so much the same.
Speaking of Asia, we mentioned the individualist, collectivist cultures a little bit. Quote, individualist, collectivist cultural contrasts are striking. In individualist cultures, people more frequently seek uniqueness and personal accomplishment. They use first-person singular pronouns more often, define themselves in terms that are personal, like I'm a contractor, rather than relational, I'm a parent.
Obviously, both individualist and collectivist cultures hate out groups. Obviously, we all hate out groups, okay? But only individualist groups inflate their assessment of their own in-group. Quote, in other words, East Asians, unlike Americans, don't have to puff up their own group to view others as inferior.
Unlike Americans.
That's progress.
We're the experts at puffing up.
America, the most individualist country, is made up of individualists. Who the fuck gets on the boat, crosses stormy oceans, and learns a completely new language?
Yeah.
Americans do. People who yearn to be free, to be rich, to get out of this boring little hamlet and push the frontier. Optimists and individualists throughout history have been attracted to America.
So that's actually, in Molecule of More, they bring up a point that America has by far the highest rates of bipolar.
Oh, bipolar. Yeah, of course.
The highest rates of bipolar because that's a dopaminergic disease. Who do you think's coming to America? We're like cutting off that the cream layer of all the really high dopamine,
high energy,
people.
high new novelty seeking people.
Probably people with the dopamine receptor least receptive to dopamine, the ones who aren't satisfied with their little hamlet. Who is satisfied with their hamlet? Which cultures have the highest rates of the dopamine receptor that doesn't need a lot of dopamine? Is very good.
It doesn't need new things. Well, how about meanwhile in China?
Yeah.
You need a lot of people making rice nonstop.
Yeah, and that's all you do is make rice year after year.
Everybody needs to pitch in and terrace the rice up, right? It's way oversimplified, but the dopamine receptor most common in China is basically calibrated to say that rice field is enough for me. That's all I need, right? So way oversimplifying again, but we're just saying these are propensities for different types of behaviors in different cultures. And you know which cultures with the least receptive dopamine receptors
are the cultures in the Amazon. Those people, that's the 7R allele, which is the least receptive to dopamine, and those are the ones who kept pushing and pushing. It's true, the East Asians have the most receptive dopamine receptor that's good with less novelty. So, oversimplified, again, it's all about propensities, but that's still pretty damn interesting when you think about the evolutionary histories of both of those groups, where East Asia has been under states for thousands of years now. Like China was centralized in like early 2000 and has basically been governed by a central power for the last couple thousand years. Whereas in the Amazon, a little bit less so.
No, not so much central power.
So the rest of this chapter on cultural evolution and everything kind of follows the outline of Sapiens. We're going to skip that. Chapter 10 is about like evolutionary history. What does that sound like?
Selfish gene.
We covered
by the
selfish
way,
gene.
You're all welcome for being loyal Brother Books listeners. We've been pounding through this material already.
Yeah, we get to skip.
We got a
books.
whole other podcast, season 1, about that.
Yeah.
Now we're going to get to, that's Behave Part 1, I think.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, we're done. Here's the end quote to sum up Behave Part 1, where we went from 1 second before the behavior all through our, all the way
genetics
through
and how culture formed our genetics, Jay.
Quote, remarkably, we've finished this part of the book. A behavior has occurred. What happened in everything from a second to a million years earlier that helps explain why it happened? Some themes have come up repeatedly. The context and meaning of a behavior are usually more interesting and complex than the mechanisms or the mechanics of the behavior. To understand things, you must incorporate neurons and hormones and early development and genes, etc., etc. These aren't separate categories. There are few clear-cut causal agents, so don't count on there being the brain region, the neurotransmitter, the gene, the cultural influence, or the single anything that explains a behavior. This is such a great quote. Instead of causes, biology is repeatedly about propensities, potentials, vulnerabilities, predispositions, proclivities. This is the
elephant talk. Yeah.
Interactions, modulations, contingencies, if-then clauses, context dependencies, exacerbation or diminution of
diminution, right?
Of pre-existing tendencies, circles and loops and spirals and Mobius strips. No one said this was easy, but the subject matters, and thus we transition to the second part. And finish up the first part, where in the second part, he's going to talk about a little more of an abstract layer. Like we look at us versus them, we look at war, we look at religion, we look at free will, all of these like classes of behavior that biology and all of the things that we've discussed so far, they shed light on those classes.
Why all these big categories of behavior happen.
Yeah.
Which is cool how he does it. So he talks about all the biology and like organizes by seconds before to millennia before. And then he kind of talks about big biological behavior categories and like breaks it down through all the layers and shows you what's going on.
So that was this one. Part 1 is longer than part 2. This was 20 28
page outline, Jay. We've been working on it for 3 years.
Yeah.
We crushed Behave Part 1.
Crushed it.
Let's go. Behave Part 2.
Part 2.
Bang. Quick high five for that. Bang.
Behave.
Behave Part 2. Here we go, baby.
So that was covering all the biological influences on our behavior. And now we talk about different categories of behavior and how the underlying biology influences what we do. So we're going to talk us versus them. We talk about hierarchies. We talk about morality. We talk about empathy. We talk about religion, war, free will, all of these like more abstract layers.
Behavioral concepts.
Yeah.
But chapter 11 begins us versus them.
This is the big one here. This is
a
probably
big
the big
chapter.
takeaway of like everything's us for them.
Us, them. Group formation, very important.
So much so that on the set of Planet of the Apes,
Crazy.
the people who dressed up as gorillas ate their lunch only with other gorillas, and the chimps ate away from all
The
of the
people who are dressing up like
Yeah,
gorillas.
come on. It's the chimp team versus the gorilla team. Like, it's so obvious, though, right? Like, you can just see how, like, if I was a gorilla, obviously I'm just going to eat with the other gorillas. Like,
So we're going to cut away from all of the hilarious stories of us creating arbitrary us's and thems, which we always do all the time, and go straight to the big question. Can we change who's an us and who's a them?
we learned in chapter 3 that faces of someone of another race pre-consciously triggers the amygdala a little bit, and then your PFC tells it to shut up. But we're off to a depressing start.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, by age 3 to 4, kids are already group people by race and gender, have more negative views of such thems, and perceive other race faces as being angrier than same race faces.
3 to 4 years old and kids are already doing this.
Already.
It's subconscious. It's part of our genetics, unfortunately. In part 1, we also learned about that beautiful oxytocin, that hormone that makes us such a good person to other us's. It makes us a dickwad to all the thems. And it makes our us group a tighter group. Doesn't necessarily open us up to wider circles, though, but that's oxytocin.
So here, we're skip this study a little bit, but implicit bias testing, where like this is actually something that I don't think has been coming through or been replicating super well, but it's just kind of, this makes sense. Like you take this was, done a while ago, so the words are a little older, but if you take a conservative American and then you flash the words Clinton and flash the word sunshine, it takes them a while longer than normal to process those because Clinton sets up the scene of like, no sunshine. I hate Clinton, Same thing with liberals and flowers and George W. Okay. So like these things, they set up context, like, and that's how processing kind of works. Like you have you're in a certain context, you're expecting to hear a certain word. Sometimes when you hear a word you don't expect, it takes a while to more process it.
So when evaluating our behavior, we need to remember that we're not just fighting neighbors over resources. We have negative associations with those neighbors. Those guys over there are like yucky spiders, but us, we are luscious tropical fruit, right?
Yeah,
that's how the brain, that's how it works.
Well, here's the point where that content or that quote makes sense, was that they do the same implicit bias test on monkeys, and they have the same response. Like they can show members of their in-group and show luscious fruit, and it kind of makes sense. Like their brain recognizes their
luscious fruit, members of the in-group, great.
It sets it up to processing, and then they show their out-group and yucky spiders, process them more quickly. So that was the interesting thing. And
this is a favorite topic of mine that he starts to get into, is how much of our human behavior is dependent upon groups and how our groups really behave in general. And he says groups are centered around values. For example, there's a group of humans that eat cows and think that.
So here's a good example.
Great.
Like there's groups of humans that eat cows. You can imagine how those people are dressed. Maybe you can picture someone who likes eating cows. Now think about a group who doesn't eat cows, who maybe worships cows. How's that group dressed?
Do they wear leather boots? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
So cowboy hats or saris, quote, what we then do is link arbitrary markers to meaningful differences in values and beliefs. That's what he's talking about. How are they dressed? Arbitrary markers. So
we're like Pavlov's dogs for what people wear. If you belong to the cowboy hat wearing group, another cowboy hat becomes a Pavlovian trigger for values. Like cowboy equals cow eater.
Equals, I'm probably going to be friends with that guy. We have similar values.
Or
we eat the same thing.
The sorry. Like we use these arbitrary images or whatever, symbols, and then we imbue them with lots of values.
Quote, similarly, an arbitrary symbol of an us core value gradually takes on a life and power of its own, becoming the signified instead of the signifier.
That's some philosophy talk, I think.
Thus, for example, the scattering of colors and patterns on cloth that constitutes a nation's flag becomes something that people will kill and die for.
So he tells this great story. We actually talk about this later in the book, about this guy, like, I think it was in Battle of Gettysburg. And, you know, somebody picks up the flag. Obviously, the other side wants to shoot the guy with the flag. And, like, 6 people all died trying to, you know, run out and grab this flag.
Not 6 people. He says up to 30 people. I don't know what the numbers are. But
yeah, maybe I made up 30.
One guy dies holding the flag. Next guy holds the flag, dies. Next guy holds up the flag, dies. Like, but that's how important it was that so many people died holding up that flag.
We all care about that flag so much because that flag is a signifier of values and us's.
Wow. Quote, thus the strength of us-theming is shown by many different things, including the speed and minimal sensory stimuli required for the brain to process group differences, the unconscious automaticity of such processes, its presence in other primates and very young humans, and the tendency to group according to arbitrary differences and then to imbue those markers with power. Boom. Everybody and everything is either an us or a them. That's just what we're doing, almost automatic all the time. So us's and thems.
We're going to start with us.
The love the us's. Who doesn't love a good us? Right?
Yeah, way better than thems. Sapolsky says that us's, or for us's, even more important than a feeling of superiority is a feeling of reciprocity and mutuality. Like, the point isn't that we form groups to feel superior. We form groups to engage in reciprocal behavior, to kind of prop each other up, to help each other out, to that's why we form tribes. So what if you piss off your group and need to get their support again?
Quote, the guiltier the person feels about her in-group violation, the worse she is to the out-group. Thus, sometimes you help us by directly helping us. Sometimes you help us by directly hurting them. What if someone in your group pisses you off? We screw up because of special circumstances, okay?
Yeah.
They screw up because that's how they are, right?
Yeah,
so we always have an explanation, I'm so sorry, and never. But those people that screw up, they're terrible, right?
Yeah, and I don't know why we skipped to this part, but think about all the people who packed the Colosseum just to watch slaves get eaten by bears. There's a lot of people for them. That was like the top entertainment.
Yeah. College football.
Isn't that kind of morally disgusting now? But what's going on in the brain? Why do we find that morally disgusting?
It's the damn insular cortex right now, guys. Remember that insular cortex triggered when we bite into rotten food? In humans, the insular cortex portfolio also includes moral and aesthetic disgust. We talked about this. Pictures of drug addicts or the homeless typically activate the insula, not the amygdala.
Interesting. So I think that what we're saying is that the amygdala or the insular cortex is a very key component to us theming. Like
it's disgusting out there, and we're nice in here, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Quote, us-them markers provide a stepping stone. Feeling disgusted by them because they eat repulsive, sacred, or adorable things, slather themselves with rancid scents, dress in scandalous ways. These are things that the insula can sink its teeth into. In the words of the psychologist Paul Rosen, disgust serves as an ethnic or outgroup marker. Establishing that they eat disgusting things provides momentum for deciding that they also have disgusting ideas about, say, deontological ethics.
Thoughts versus feelings. When we talk about us versus them, let's look about thoughts and feelings and how those are affected. So, are we going with intuitions first and then using our reasoning to confirm our intuitions?
That was a very astute
Obviously we are. Come on. We always say that. Sapolsky, summing it up, says, quote, despite the importance of thought in us-theming, the core is emotional and automatic.
A study, here's a great little study.
Yeah.
So it takes 2 sweaters.
This is super interesting.
Worn by 2 famous people. So we got JFK and Bernie Madoff.
Same sweater, probably. Same brand.
Well, okay. So they each
2
have a
different
sweater.
sweaters. Yeah, it looks the same.
Hypothetically, if you washed the JFK sweater before an auction, that would decrease its value at auction. Like, people don't want you to wash that JFK sweater. They want the JFK cooties on the sweater. Whereas, quote, unwashed Madoff sweaters swarm with moral taint cooties. Because people would assume it has increased value if you washed Madoff sweater.
And you don't even need to explain it. Like, I would only wear Madoffs if it was washed, and JFK's you'd hang on the wall if it wasn't washed only. You know what I mean? It's crazy. So he creates a really funny thought experiment here. Imagine you ask the Republican and Democratic parties about what their stance on hanging chads before the controversial Bush election was.
Who would have an opinion on whether
hanging chads?
What's that? The chad is that like little piece when you punch
like
card
a whole
the
punch. That's like, is it all the way punch? Is it halfway punch?
Yeah, they didn't get fully punched. Who could possibly have an opinion on that pre-election? But post, what's the quote?
And yet here we are, post-election, 1 millisecond post-chads, that is, with each party passionately explaining why the view of the opposing thems threatened mom, apple pie, and the legacy of the Alamo, right? Everyone had a million rationalizations why their interpretation of chads was the right one. Mm-hmm. That's crazy. And we love Sapolsky, and we just wish he was still writing more about, current world today, because he had so much to talk about. Oh my gosh,
because think about the things about like masks and ivermectin and all this great stuff where, oh man, it would have been such great content.
Such good fodder for us themming and in-group, out-group, and the whole thing. It's all there, for sure. So quote, the confirmation biases used to rationalize and justify automatic themming are numerous. Remembering supportive evidence better than opposing evidence, testing things in ways that can support but not negate your hypotheses, skeptically probing outcomes you don't like more than the ones that you do. This is all pure. I was actually going to say this already. This is pure righteous mind again. It's just elephant and rider, our intuitions are leading us, and our logic reasoning just kind of follows us to back us up. So
now we're going to take things to group level dynamics a little bit. This is a pretty quick little section, but pretty obvious that we are a group of individuals. Like us's, I've got lots of individuated us's that build an us, but they are disgusting, ridiculous, simple, homogeneous, undifferentiated, and interchangeable. All of those feelings and thoughts are backed up by our trusty reasoning skills, which amplifies us themming like nothing else.
And here's a quote from some writer guy, Reinhold Niebuhr, around World War II. Thank you, Niebuhr. Quote, the group is more arrogant, hypocritical, self-centered, and more ruthless in the pursuit of its ends than the individual.
That's an interesting one.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, you just become part of the group, and then that pure rationality, disconnected from any emotionality, kicks in probably, and like we're able to do crazier things.
And JD's been on a huge Native American frontier violence kick right now, Jay, or Israel-Palestine kick.
There's just so much good us theming through history and seeing different, how us's and thems
used to be
relate.
Different tribes were us, them, and then the white man came, and then they're all the tribes are us versus the white man, them. Like, it's just like, how does it,
Groups scale up these conflicts to full-on wars and occupations. Quote, there is often an inverse relationship between levels of intra-group and intergroup aggression. But is that inverse relationship causal? Must a society suppress homicide to accomplish genocide?
Whoa.
These are the big questions Sapolsky's asking. Or to reverse the causality, do threats from thems make societies more internally cooperative?
Whoa, Sapolsky. He's really bringing in the philosophical questions that aren't, he doesn't even answer those ones.
Yeah.
He just brings them up, which is tantalizing.
So obviously we're oversimplifying. There we belong. And here's
a human. So many categories of us. That's part of it, right?
So many. There's the us on my soccer league. There's the us in like my band or whatever.
There's the us Tool fans. There's us Michigan fans. I mean, there's just a million us's. It's like
And the importance of these categories change all the time. This is a great quote.
If some octopus moved in next door, I would feel hostile superiority because I have a spine and that octopus doesn't. But that animosity might melt into a sense of kinship when I discovered that octopus, like me, loved playing Twister as a kid, right? Oh, I had something similar with the octopus. Now we're buddies. Now we're in us again. We were them. Now we're in us. It's so funny how that works,
Here's
right?
another good...
this one's even cooler, Jay.
Yeah. This is back to the Battle of Gettysburg.
In the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate General Lewis Armistead was mortally wounded while leading a charge. As he lay on the battlefield, he gave a secret Masonic sign in hopes of being recognized by a fellow Mason. He was recognized by a Union officer, and that Union officer protected him, got him to a Union field hospital, and guarded his personal effects. In an instant, the us-them of Union Confederate became less important than the us of Mason. That is Jay, you had tens of thousands of guys on each side running to kill each other, but the moment you flash a different group sign on the battlefield, you get saved by the guy you were trying to kill a second ago.
Us, them. Yeah,
that's crazy.
It's a good example of how the us, them switch a lot. And another one is that the Irish on both sides of the Civil War put green leaves in their hats, so they would trigger some us mechanisms in those thems on whatever side. Obviously, this makes us think of the World War I Christmas truce.
Which is crazy. That us, them was, hey, we're fighting each other, but hey, we're all us's. It's Christmas. Let's sing some songs, right? We're both Christian on each side of it.
Play soccer. So we're going to bring things home. We're going to compare us humans to them chimps.
Wild. Quote, even if he could, no chimp would ever deny that neighboring chimps remind him of bad, ugly, disgusting spiders.
Even if he could.
Even if he could, he would never say that.
Why would I say
None
that?
would feel bad about it. They wouldn't question it. Urge others to overcome that tendency, teach their children to never call one of those neighboring chimps a spider. None would proclaim that he can't distinguish between us chimps and them chimps. And these are all commonplace in progressive Western cultures. That's a cool way to talk about how we're different than chimps. We actually have the ability to realize that that's bad, calling them's them, and try and change it.
Yeah, that's our frontal cortex.
Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking
action.
that.
Like we said earlier, other raised faces pre-consciously trigger the amygdala, and the frontal cortex is like, shut up, it's just another dude. So you better have, your society has those PFCs tuned up.
Yeah, you better hope for that, for sure. So here's the big sum up quote: from massive, breathtaking barbarity to countless pinpricks of microaggression, us versus them has produced oceans of pain. But is it all bad? What's the best thing in life, Jay?
Being with us's.
We love being with us's, dude. Who doesn't want to be in a team?
Feeling accepted.
I don't even know if this is true or I'm making it up. But, dude, if you're on teams, you're healthier. It's just obvious.
Yeah.
Okay? Boom. Andrew's facts right there. Okay, right.
So there's the us versus them chapter. Now we're moving on to chapter 12. Hierarchy, obedience, and resistance. We're evaluating the biology of hierarchical systems and hierarchical categories of behavior. So dominance hierarchies, Jordan Peterson shit. So
love this.
Dominance hierarchies in our ape history is how we decide who eats the best food, who has sexual access to fertile females, who breaks up fights, who kind of manages the whole group. And the stereotype is that the alpha male is the violent member of the group.
Strongest, most violent, yeah.
And that may be what's required to get high rank, but like we said earlier, maintaining high rank is much more about social intelligence. You have to break up fights, build coalitions, settle disputes, you have to do favors for important people. Like any politician knows that.
And if you want to read more about this, Chimpanzee Politics is an incredible story about this. Some guy spent 30 years evaluating the politics of a chimp troop in the zoo.
Which was basically, it's the story of a big, dumb, aggressive chimp. Exactly that. This big, dumb, aggressive chimp became alpha, but he was overthrown by the older, wiser chimp because that chimp knew how to build friendships and build coalitions and hey, you do this, scratch my back, I scratch yours. So that takes a lot of brain power to manage that. And that reminds us of the Robin Dunbar study we talked about in Sapiens that showed that in birds and primates, the larger the social group, the larger the frontal cortex. Just makes sense.
Increases in social complexity and brain complexity are linked. That's obviously the case among humans as well. One study found people with large social groups have enlarged centers in the brain associated with theory of mind. Even babies can detect hierarchies. Babies decide to learn from people highest in the hierarchy, the best at whatever task.
So
that's crazy.
I remembered the book.
Dude, I was just thinking, if you're a kid, you wear the athletes' jerseys because they're the best at it. You know what I mean?
And that's the thing. There was a book was Secrets of Our Success. It's a great book. Joe Heinrich. He talks about how babies are so good at picking up the who looks up to who admires whom, who should they follow in a given task. Even babies can figure that out. We engage our theory of mind muscles more when the person is high status, when we're interacting with someone, aka we want to know what they're thinking. It's important. So it ties back into testosterone, because if you win a competition, you get a higher bit of testosterone, but only if you won it by skill and not by luck. We have these ideas of things, did I actually deserve that? That's relevant to our biology, is our feeling of deserved in the hierarchy.
But Jay, wouldn't you expect then that the alpha chimp always has the highest testosterone? No, the lower or middle guys have the highest testosterone because they have got to start a lot of fights to move up the testosterone chain, right? Yeah. Move up the chain. The top guy just needs to keep the peace and he's good. The top guy's theory of mind strengthens once he gets in the top job. He's got to understand why fights are happening to resolve them correctly and thereby gain more status in his group. The middle rank guys also feel more stress, which is obviously the same in humans. Middle management always is the most stressed because they have so much responsibility and so little autonomy. But there's another deep point about testosterone. It's not necessarily related to aggression or fighting, but rather the challenge itself. And now that we're wrapping up the testosterone chapter with the hierarchy chapter, because testosterone is really about your status in the hierarchy. That's when you fire off testosterone, right?
Quote, if your status is maintained by aggression, testosterone fosters aggression. If your status were maintained by writing beautiful, delicate haikus, testosterone would foster that. And we do write delicate haikus. And testosterone does make us do that. Like, I'm an artist. Part of the reason I'm an artist is because women like artists. I love that I wrote this. If women were into Night Elf rogues, maybe I'd still be playing Warcraft.
So if you put people in a scanner and you show them a sad video like People in Pain, the more you value power and prestige, the less activity we see in parts of your brain associated with empathy. The more you care about power, the less empathy you have. That's crazy.
Politicians aren't super empathetic.
Yeah, well, I don't think Trump is known for his empathy, right?
No, he doesn't care.
He doesn't care. People like this...
You can't get to a spot like that if you care.
If you're super empathetic. Yeah, it's absolutely. People like this seem to have a dampened ability to feel for those less fortunate. Seems kind of obvious.
And here's the sum up about us Homo sapiens is we have, quote, the most this is his hobby horse here. Sapolsky hates this. We have, quote, the most permeating form of status any primate has invented, namely socioeconomic status.
Whoa, and here's a quick
SES.
Socioeconomic status summary from chapter 9.
Chapter 9, I think, was on
childhood, womb. Childhood. If your womb belongs to a low SES mom, you're more likely to have bad health. It gets worse as SES gets lower. This occurs even in countries with universal health care. Subjective SES predicts health about as much as objective measures.
Wow.
Also known as, AKA, it's not about being poor, it's about feeling poor compared to your fellow humans. Wow. Quote, in terms of its caustic, scarring impact on minds and bodies, nothing in the history of animals being crappy to one another about status differences comes within light years of humans' invention of poverty. End quote. Whoa.
And SES, it's not the only all-pervading hierarchy we've got. Think about physical attractiveness. Attractive people are rated, quote, rated as having better personalities, higher moral standards, and as being kinder, more honest, more friendly, and more trustworthy. We just like attractive people more. We want to see them. We want to hire them. We pay them more. It's called the halo effect. And those are people sitting on juries. The people are voting for more attractive people.
That's how democracy works.
This
study's crazy.
5-year-old kids. You give them faces of candidates from like obscure other countries' elections, this guy versus this guy. You ask them.
5-year-olds, you ask them.
Who do you want to be captain of your boat trip?
We're going on a boat trip for 5-year-olds. 2 pictures. Pick your captain.
What percentage correctly did they guess of these elections?
I mean, obviously we're bringing it up so it's crazy. Yeah. But it is crazy.
71% of the time, the 5-year-olds, quote, picked the right person, demonstrating that these are some very generalized, deeply entrenched biases. And then our conscious cognitions play catch up to make our decisions seem careful and wise.
That's such a great study. Rider. It's like, dude, 5-year-olds can basically pick elections with 71% accuracy based on a yearbook photo of the candidates.
Boat captain. We're all picking boat.
We're all picking boat captain. 71% 5-year-old. It's just like crazy that's how accurate that is.
Quote:
God.
Choosing of leaders is shaped by implicit automatic factors more suitable to 5-year-olds deciding who should captain their boat on a voyage with the Teletubbies to Candyland. And we all know that this is how the dating game works too. So check out the grouse dating game if you don't believe us.
Tinder coming at you.
A male grouse gets rejected by a female grouse. Ouch. You hear David Attenborough's voice.
Ooh, and the male will try again next time.
Researchers will surround that male grouse with some wrapped, stuffed female grouse, put female grouse dummies, and now he's the hottest grouse stud on the prairie. Soon, the reluctant maiden is all over him, pushing her statuesque rivals aside. So, this is our writing. Good reason to have a stuffed grouse at the club with you. Never leave.
That's so crazy, but we all get it so much. You know,
Yeah.
it's like the same thing with girls. If you have a hot girl with you, then other hot girls want to be with you. You know, it's just like, that's how it works.
Wing women.
Wing woman, grouse wing woman, let's go.
Grouse or human. If other women like it, I like it. We're all like that. It's not just women and men. You know, it's the same thing with men, you know.
Crazy. So if you give chimps 2 ways to do something,
This is a crazy one.
they're gonna do it whatever way the alpha chimp does it.
Even if they came up with a different way, might even be a better way to do it. So like the way they do it is there's like a box with a treat inside, and there's some complicated opening mechanism, and there's 2, ways to get that box open. Well, whatever way the alpha does it, eventually that's going to spread to everybody, even if other people came up with a different way.
I'm gonna throw this one in here. We didn't even write it down, but this sounds a lot to me like mimetic theory, and we're gonna cover that, Renee Girard, mimetic theory, a lot more about how we really all are just imitating other people's behaviors, and what Renee says more so is imitating other people's deep desires for what their life is going to become.
Because apparently imitating feels good.
Yes.
Like this is what Sapolsky says, that it stimulates our limbic dopamine system, which is, the limbic dopamine is a little bit more like base pleasure.
Feels good to imitate. Feels good to be part of the team.
It's good to belong.
Evolutionary makes sense. You want to be part of the team, you're going to survive. If you're not part of the team, you're probably going to die, right?
So let's inactivate our VMPFCs. You remember that? That was the part of the prefrontal cortex that connects back into our limbic system.
Right.
That part. If you inactivate it, you separate the rational thought from your emotional intuition. That's been the way we're oversimplifying it. Those studies where like everybody, what's 5 times 5? And then everybody in the study is a Confederate and they all say 15. And you're like, what the hell?
Are you going to say 25 or 15?
Yeah. If you inactivate the VMPFC, you are less likely to change your answer to fit into the group.
Wow, interesting.
You're more purely rational about that particular circumstances, because you don't hear that your amygdala is absolutely freaking out. Everybody's saying 15, say 15, like do what they are
Just
doing.
stick with the group. Amygdala says I'm scared.
So the VMPFC is the one connected to it, and that might bring to mind the Milgram obedience experiment or the Zimbardo prison experiment. We're not going to talk about that because they're also being not replicating out super well. But here's an interesting one that lethal injection machines have 2 buttons, and it takes 2 people pressing each button at the same time to do it, because there's only a 50-50 chance that it was your batch of poison, that it was your thumb that triggered that poison to go into that person's body. That's the only way people are going to push these buttons, is if there's a 50 chance that they didn't do it, that it wasn't their poison that does it. For
sure. And here's another one. In traditional human societies, warriors who transform and standardize their appearance before battle are more likely to torture and mutilate their enemies than warriors from cultures that don't transform themselves.
And here is the deep, dark point that Sapolsky makes about that, is that maybe that war paint is not so that thems won't recognize you, because chances are you're not going to have any future run-ins with thems, but it's rather that us's won't recognize you afterwards.
So you have to paint yourself up like an us.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm a big us here.
Yeah,
whoa,
so you kind of fit into the group, and people aren't like, wow, that guy's crazy. No, we're just a big group of us doing crazy shit.
Yeah, we're all look the same. We are like, chapter sum up, us versus them. We're like many other species in these ways. We have status hierarchies. We perceive status differences super easily. We don't like when status is undecided.
That was a point we didn't really talk about, but he does in the book.
Yeah, we all need to rank ourselves immediately.
It's stressful if we don't know where we fit in the hierarchy. Like, that's a bad situation. If you want to have it all be kind of decided. It's an interesting one. Mm-hmm. Our frontal cortex have evolved to handle this social complexity of status differences. High rank requires that you can handle the most social complexity. Like, you better hope that your frontal cortex can help you ignore some provocations and be a good arbiter of disputes if you want to stay on top. Like, people are going to be assholes to you, and if you respond to every little dipshit doing stuff, people are going to be like, what? Like, that guy's got no chill. He can't be a leader.
Yeah, for sure.
And that leads to more of your children and grandchildren being born with big, strong frontal cortexes. Like the people who have the most sexual access to the females are the ones that are the best at theory of mind engaging and everything. Like, I wonder if that would create an evolutionary runaway process that increases size of our prefrontal cortexes from like 17 cubic inches to whatever.
Take.
That was the sapiens thing that we talked about.
Yeah. And then on the opposite side of the hierarchy kingdom, if you're low rank, it is super stressful and unhealthy generally. Like, it's just not healthy to be low rank. Don't be low rank. It's terrible. So we're super different from all other species in many ways.
Yeah, those were the ways that we're
similar to species, but we're so different in so many other ways. One of them, we all have like tons of different hierarchies that shift in importance in different contexts.
Yeah, like I'm a better bird watcher than Andrew, so I'm way on top in that hierarchy. And for me, that is a damn important hierarchy.
My hierarchy, I play the drums better than JD.
Yeah. So we use our frontal cortex to reason, but only to support what we feel emotionally. And quote, finally, the pull of conformity and obedience can lead us to some of our darkest, most appalling places, and far more of us can be led there than we'd like to think. I think that's funny that we're closing on that dark quote. Just to remind us, we're horrible. And
there's so many quotes and there's so many dark quotes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to close on a dark quote on this one.
Chapter 13 is about morality and doing the right thing.
Once you figured out what the right thing is to do, and that's a great chapter title, but we're skipping chapter 13. Sorry, chapter 13.
Basically, righteous mind.
Dude, again, Johnny Height, our boy. But here we go. Chapter 14, feeling someone's pain as your own. This chapter has two key questions. One, when does empathy actually lead us to do the right thing?
That's a good one. Like, we all feel empathy. But
when does it actually do the right thing? And then
does it help us do the right thing?
When does it help us do the right thing? And two, when we do act, whose benefit is it for?
Cui bono on this empathy.
Cui bono, Jay. Great one.
What does that mean? Who benefits? Yeah,
who benefits?
Lots of animals have empathy, but especially empathy for their friends, relatives. That's kin selection.
Kin, we all know about that. Come on.
But these are the animals that have that comfort their friends when something bad happens to them. Think about that. Like most animals, centipedes aren't comforting their friends if something bad happens to them. But these animals do. Apes, dogs, wolves, elephants, and crows.
But not monkeys. Interesting cognitive difference with monkeys.
I find that
monkeys. That makes me stressed out for monkeys right there.
Oh, monkeys suck. They suck to each other.
Okay.
But rats are going to work as hard as they would to get chocolate to try to free another rat that's trapped in a cage. Like, freeing a trapped rat is as valuable to me as chocolate, only if that rat is genetically similar to me, aka rats are a little racist. They're rats.
What's going on in the brain? I know what you're thinking. Smells like the anterior cingulate cortex there, Jay, the little ACC.
ACC, quote, when it comes to empathy, all neurobiological roads pass through the ACC. In your brain, the ACC is your empathy station. It turns gut feelings, literal signals from the gut, into intuitions inside your brain.
ACC, if you block oxytocin in a vole's ACC, it doesn't console his buddy that just got a shock. Cutting off the ACC turns these voles into sociopaths.
What about our frontal cortex? To sum up, the frontal cortex is kind of like a gatekeeper that decides who to empathize with. Like, your ACC is going to generate emotion. That's why like people feel bad if like you kill a spider or whatever. Because for some people, their prefrontal cortex is like, you don't feel bad for spiders. Some people do feel bad for deciders. So the frontal cortex is the gatekeeper. How bad should I feel? This is such a dark example.
No, here we go.
Somebody's got HIV. That sucks. But our PFC is going to ask, hey, did they get HIV from a blood transfusion or from sharing heroin needles? Like, the first person is going to get our ACC empathy. Like, that was just a random fluke accident. Wasn't their fault.
Wow.
That's a horrible tragedy. But the second person, like, come on, you were sharing needles. Like,
our deliberative PFC, the logical PFC is going to block the empathy feelings for that person that made bad decisions in our mind for why they have
we are
HIV.
selective
Wow.
about who we can empathize with, which
Interesting.
Sapolsky says has negative consequences.
And here's a Mother Teresa quote about this. Quote, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will.
And so that reminds us of Paul Bloom's book Against Empathy. We haven't read it, heard it on some podcasts, but I mean, that's the main point, is that relying on empathy for our good, like, pro-social emotions is not a very good one, because like we talk about later, this priest going to give final rites of people to the hospital, like, you want to talk to people that are attractive, that are younger, that are healthier, like our empathy is triggered more for cute, adorable things.
Young, attractive, verbal, intelligent, social. That's like the category that he talks about, people that we want to talk to. And isn't it obvious that we'd want to spend more time with those types of people?
Yeah, so that we find some inspiration in this priest that made a point to spend more time with people who are older, less attractive, maybe nonverbal, not everything, because, it just makes sense that we would selectively go towards these other people. It seems like a very godly person to be able to make that.
So wrapping it up and talking about empathy uses both rationality and emotion, but it relies on your cognition more when you don't know the person being empathized with.
Which seems obvious.
Yes. But let's get to the main issue here, Jay. When does empathy actually make us do something versus just feel something?
Yeah.
When does that happen?
That was the main question of the chapter, because being in an empathetic state is less correlated with actually doing something that you would think. Quote, the peril of empathy isn't simply that it can make us feel bad, but that it can make us feel good, which can in turn encourage us to think of empathy as an end in itself rather than part of a process, a catalyst.
There's a study that showed that people who respond with stress hormones to someone in need were less likely to help than someone who remained calm.
And it makes sense, like empathy.
That's crazy.
So the empathy would maybe generate glucocorticoids in your system, which, like we said, cuts out your your logical PFC from the behavior decision tree, and it turns more into a loop between your amygdala and your hippocampus, like, I don't know what to do, and you're not taking in new information, where somebody who remains calm, somebody who has less stress hormones, is somebody more likely to be able to spring into action to figure out, I got to jump into the subway hole and pull this person out. Where somebody who's stressed out, just like...
And so the stress created from empathizing actually stops us from helping who we're empathizing with.
Which
that kind of seems backwards.
It's dark.
But here's some more good empathy findings. If you're instructed to spend money on your group or yourself, which one actually makes you feel better? If you spend money on your group or yourself, which one, Jay?
Obviously, community.
You feel so good about spending money on the community, right?
Yeah.
So even though we all think we'd be happier spending the money on ourselves, it's the community that really triggers us.
We've all heard that one.
Yeah. And here's the last cherry-picked study that we're going here to sum up this chapter. If you put some people who just won money in an MRI, ask them how they're going to spend it, they release a little pleasurable dopamine when they think about giving it to charity. Only if someone else is there to hear them say they're giving it to charity. I love that, dude.
Why would I care about getting to charity if nobody can see that I'm giving to charity?
It to charity. Yeah.
So this is a great dark sum up quote. Better that our good acts be self-serving and self-aggrandizing than that they don't occur at all.
Boom.
Thank you, Sapolsky. That was chapter 14, empathy. Now we're moving on to chapter 15. What's that subtitle?
Metaphors we kill by. Boom.
Only Sapolsky with a chapter title like that. So this is the structure of this chapter. Here's a couple examples of metaphors.
Metaphors that we kill for.
Example 1, Abrahamic religions, they seem to have a thing about graven images. They're kind of iffy. They really do. We're iffy on graven images. For a while, it was Jews destroying images and all the calf talk, no golden calves. Then Christians were destroying images. Now the ones who do it mostly seem to be Sunni Muslims. Apparently, we don't remember this, but in 2005, a Danish company published a cartoon of Muhammad, and people were killed by rioters in all of these countries. Nigeria, Italy, Turkey, and Egypt.
That's crazy. Is that Hebdo? Is that Charlie Hebdo, or is that something else?
That was another time that another
cartoon came out with Muhammad, dude. That's crazy. People are literally killing because of cartoons.
Metaphors to kill by. Hit them with example 2.
The story that we talked about, it really happened. One dude waving a flag. We don't even know if it was Confederate or Union flag
Doesn't
anymore.
matter. Everybody wants to kill the guy with the flag.
But he got shot down. Next guy picks up the flag, symbolizing he gets shot down. Next guy picks up the flag, and in the book he says, 30 people died picking up the flag at a Civil War battle at Gettysburg because they were just holding up that symbol, that metaphor for the way they wanted to live the world. 30 people.
And actually, so I cut this out, but his last example was Irish political prisoners. They went on a hunger strike and killed themselves because they didn't feel it was appropriate for them to wear the normal prisoner wear. They wanted to be, wearing political prisoner outfits or whatever.
Wow.
So what he said, this is the quote. In other words, people are willing to kill or be killed over a cartoon, a flag, and a piece of clothing. So we've got some explaining to do.
When you think about evolution, that doesn't make sense. All of that stuff. It's like you're dying over a cartoon, but there's so many layers to our
group dynamic, the us's and the thems. It's way more important. That's why group level selection. That's why that's kind of coming back more into.
Huge fan of group level selection. I know
Dawkins hates it, but
Sorry, Dawkins, you missed it, bro.
Sorry, Doc.
Dawkins hasn't had anything to say since 1972.
So,
whoa, hot take when he wrote Selfish Gene.
Again,
probably wrong.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dawkins.
Hugely wrong. This chapter, we're diving into neurobiology of symbolic and metaphorical thinking. That's what all of this flag, colors, the clothes, it's all symbols and metaphors, which reminds us of Sapiens with imagined realities that become, more important.
Quote, these capacities evolved so recently that our brains are, if you will, winging it and improvising on the fly when dealing with metaphor. As a result, we are actually pretty lousy at distinguishing between the metaphorical and the literal.
Another Inside Out reference, if you remember, they're on the train of thought, and then somebody knocks over boxes, and the two boxes were facts and feelings, and they all get mixed up. And then the guy's like, that happens all the time. Don't worry about that.
That's a great one. I love this. I love the train of thought too, by the way.
Because all of us we're all these metaphor machines walking around where the metaphors are influenced, are driving our behavior. And there's two very important brain regions that we've already discussed that result in all of this behavior.
The anterior cingulate cortex, the
empathy
section, and the insula.
The insula is like the disgust sensor,
These are the two important metaphor spots in our brain.
Scientifically, those are the metaphor spots.
But why these two parts? Jay, I wonder if these two parts have a high number of von Economo neurons.
Von Economo neurons, look out. Yeah, remember those are the long range, the very special
recently evolved super duper neurons.
The long range neurons that increase the small world architecture of the brain, just one small connection that goes from one disconnected part to another can vastly shorten the lengths of that signals have to traverse to do all this processing. Who's got these von Economo neurons, Andrew?
Didn't we already talk about that? Dolphins, elephants, apes, whales. I mean, those are the guys with these crazy...
He says the rest, or for who else has them, is a who's who of evolution's Mensa Club.
Love that little clever writing again,
These are the ones that are really expensive, that cost the most, but these are the neurons that are most responsible for us building friendships.
Long-lasting friendships.
Only animals with von Economo neurons build long-lasting friendships.
And humans are obviously the undisputed von Economo champs, but the next species with the most is bonobos.
Bonobos.
Where coalitions of female bonobos run the troop through sex and friendship. Interesting.
Sounds like My Little Pony, rainbows.
Pretty interesting to think that friendship requires connecting faraway parts of the brain.
Yeah, side note, we're just going to leave you with that one. So the ACC and Insula do some interesting and beautiful things with building coalitions, friendships. We all love those. Sapolsky's not going to let us dwell on all these nice things so much.
Yeah, for sure. He's got to bring in the dark.
Also why we empathize with us's, but that's...
also, I feel disgusted by thems, right? Quote, if you want to get someone to feel that an other hardly counts as human, there's only one way to do it: engage the insula. And the surest way to engage the insula is with a metaphor. Calling those else's, those thems, they're all cockroaches, they're disgusting, they're terrible, we hate them. That's how you engage people's insula and make them feel what you want them to feel.
Yeah, that sounds like the Rwandan genocide, which we're going to hit you with some numbers from that. Because
this is so crazy. Sad and crazy. April 7th, 1994, roughly 8,000 people per day chopped and stabbed to death. For 100 days straight. We looked up these numbers because we didn't want to make this up. 800,000 people murdered with no guns, no concentration camps, just a bunch of insular cortexes with radios and machetes. And that's how crazy us versus them can get. That's
Yeah.
like super sad. We're very sorry Rwandan genocide, but it's just like showing
tons
you
of
guys the
there's
depths of human depravity right
just
there.
genocides all throughout our history. That's something I've been getting into more, genetic histories and like even back like 5,000 years ago. Any language that exists only exists because other people killed the people speaking some other language that was already, in existence. Like literally all of our history is genocides. So that brings up to another idea that he calls sacred values. Quote, sacred values are defended far out of proportion to their material or instrumental importance or likelihood of success, because such values define who we are. That's like the flag thing, like raising the flag is a sacred value.
So here's a good story in a different context, talking about, how we become different us's and thems and all this kind of stuff. In Northern Ireland, after the ceasefire of 1994, a unity government was created from the two head guys on opposing sides of the fight. They had famously refused to shake hands.
Think about how much these guys would hate each other.
Their entire definition of a life was about hating each other.
Yeah.
They never shook hands until one guy's wife funneled money to her 19-year-old lover, and, quote, history was then made when one of the guys offered and the other guy accepted a commiserate handshake. That was a guy code sacred value, commiserate handshake, secret moment of like, bro, I get it, bro.
Yeah.
That sucks. And now we're on the same team in a different way.
Yeah, just like the octopus who played Twister as a kid, just like you did. It's just like these us's and them shift so quickly.
Dude, guy code transcending boundaries right there, Jay. That's crazy.
Nobody wants their wife funneling money to their secret lover, and I don't care which side of the Irish separation you're on. So here's the real champ of us versus them. This was Nelson Mandela.
Oh, yeah, dude. Big time.
Long Walk to Freedom. Great book. You still have to read that one.
Long Walk to Freedom.
27 years as a political prisoner. How did he spend that time in jail? One was writing his book. The other was he learned Afrikaans, the Dutch language that they all speak there. So when he entered negotiations with the Afrikaans-speaking apartheid government, Mandela opened by chatting in Afrikaans about rugby, which is the national Afrikaner sport.
That's super cool. Yeah. When he retired in 1999, after being prime minister and all that stuff he was, the apartheid police chief gave a speech praising Mandela in Mandela's language.
But what an us and them shift.
What a crazy thing, dude. He learned their language, talked about rugby. That guy was so honored that he learned Mandela's language to praise him at his retirement. That is amazing, South Africa. Way to go.
So here's Chapter 16 now. This is biology, the criminal justice system, and oh, why not free will. This one is the furthest out in theoretical land. Yeah. This is the most hobby horse one of Sapolsky.
And just you're getting into it, but I just want to preface it by saying okay, Jay, we have made it through 14 pages on the 18-page part 2 after the 28-page part 1. So adding it up, we're 42 of 46 pages through this outline, and you know what? That means that we're like 700 of 800 pages through Sapolsky's book.
So yeah, we can give him some leeway to say whatever the hell he wants.
This chapter where we're giving him leeway and he's taking it because this is probably the last book he's ever is going to write.
Well, I don't know about last book, but this is his magnum opus.
He's not planning another book after.
You don't magnum an opus.
He dumped everything in there. Yeah, exactly. So this is where he starts his opinion section, but let's get into it.
He wants to abolish the entire criminal justice system.
Crazy.
Get rid of it. And when you look at it the way he does, it kind of makes sense. Here's a fact. Florida used to have an actual IQ cutoff for the death penalty. Like under an IQ of 70, legally in Florida, you are too stupid to be held culpable, which Sapolsky says includes currently 20% of people on death row.
What?
Why did they overturn it? It's because apparently the Supreme Court of Florida said that IQ tests were too, wishy-washy. Like you can't, not scientific enough.
Wow.
But that is crazy. Remember, the central theme of this book being free will is all of the biology we don't understand yet. So hit us with another quote from the justice system of the 1500s.
Yeah, he's arguing that we should get rid of this justice system. This story is a great argument. It's the middle of the 1500s. Perhaps because of lax societal standards and people being morally depraved, Europe is overrun with witches. It's a huge problem. People fear going out at night. Polls show that peasants in the street list witches as more of a threat than the plague or the Ottomans.
Great threats.
Would-be despots gain supporters by vowing to be tough on witches. I'm going to crack down on the witches out here, right?
Yeah, with our 3 handy-dandy ready-made
and good thing we have these ready-made witch tests, Jay. So here's the witch tests of the 1500s. Witch test number 1. If you float in water, you clearly rejected baptism, obviously. Therefore, witch. If you float in water, that probably is going to get some false positives.
If there's a spot on the body that doesn't feel pain, that's where the devil got in.
Witch. Okay. And this one's the best. Tell the story of the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. Anyone who's not moved to tears? Jay?
Witch.
Easiest
one. That's the dead giveaway.
I'm laughing. I'm sorry, witches. It's just like laughing at the absurdity.
Honestly,
okay,
thousands of people put to death because.
Yes, it's terrible, but it's just you have to the absurdity of it. So in 1563, a Dutch physician published a book advocating some reforms on this witch test process, and the Dutch physician worded it like this. It's such a good wording. He's like, "Hey guys, whoa." Of course, there are witches. We're all good, right? Let's
Obviously,
not be ridiculous here, right?
We still have to find them.
But sometimes there's a specific tear gland that fails in older women and doesn't allow them to cry. Okay, fact. 2 facts. Witches, but there's also a tear gland. And so our test for crying based on the crucifixion story of Jesus Christ might create some false positives. Maybe that shouldn't be the test for witches.
Yeah, it's not 100% associated. Which Sapolsky makes a great point. That's a liberal reform.
That's how you reform, baby.
Well, imposing some sound thinking in one tiny corner of an irrational edifice. That's how he thinks about the whole criminal justice system.
Wow.
This is where he goes into free will. You can imagine how he feels. So we all know we think of free will as a homunculus, like there's a little person in our brain pulling the levers,
kind of controlling everything. We're behind the wheel of our own brain, kind of thing.
Yeah, like the guy behind the curtain, you know. And so this is his view on free will. Quote: "Everyone's homunculus was once too young to have its adult powers. Maybe it wasn't tall enough to reach all the control dials." AKA, come on, free will is all the biology we don't know yet. That's what he thinks about it. What about brain damage though? Like, what if somebody literally didn't have a frontal cortex? Here's the interesting thought experiment. We can all agree they're maybe less responsible than somebody with a fully plugged in prefrontal cortex, but are they 99% responsible? Are they 50% responsible? Like, where do you draw the line there? Because a huge chunk of inmates on death row have a history of frontal cortical damage early in their life, meaning they can't regulate their behaviors as somebody with a fully functioning frontal cortex. Like, what do we do about that? How do we manage the causation and the responsibility? And that's where Sapolsky says we need to throw the whole thing out because it's all biology. We're all he doesn't think we have any free will at all.
Yeah, exactly. And he's even saying that society has moved slightly towards thinking we have less free will than previously.
Which is good, we're making progress.
But we still think we have free won't, which is an interesting way to say it. So biological stuff causes stuff to happen sometimes. Maybe we're not the smartest person in the class.
Maybe we don't have those genes. Like, whatever, I'm a B student, no big deal.
But homuncular, great. I can push to work to be the hardest. She had the smart genes, but he had the harder working homunculus genes. And here's the deep sum up point. Quote, telling a child, you must work so hard is as much a property of the physical universe and the biology that emerged from it as you must be so smart. And yes, being a child molester is as much a product of biology as is being a pedophile. To think otherwise is little more than folk psychology.
I think that is such a good point.
Whoa.
Like, we all say, no matter what kind of skills you're given, you can decide what to do with them and everything. And Sapolsky's saying that deciding what to do with them is just as biological as
the skills you were given in the first place.
Yeah, like there is no kind of stepping outside the causal chain of biology. Everything is mediated through this massive, complex causal web, and Sapolsky's like, fuck it all.
Yeah, dude. And it's super interesting. He definitely made me think a lot. And if I were talking to Sapolsky, what I would ask you is, you're basically saying that science is going to march towards discovering every possible aspect of biology and describing all human behavior at some point in the millennia coming. But what I wanted to say is, what if what you determine is a line heading straight towards complete definition of humanity actually is an asymptote and will never perfectly be able to describe all of human behavior, because my emotions want there to be free will, Sapolsky. So I'm trying to find it in your logic, and I'm telling you free will is an asymptote and we'll never be able to figure it out at all. Maybe it's free will only exists at the level of the group, the level of the society. Maybe it only exists in certain people. I don't know what it is, but there's definitely something. People. I don't know.
Well, okay. We have to get out the idea.
My turn, Sapolsky. Sorry. Jake, hit him back. Get back to the book. Okay. Yeah.
We have to get the idea out of our heads that some behaviors are more biological than others. That's his main point. Everything is mediated by biology. It's just more complicated, and there's more like inputs into the causal chain to figure things out. Get this. It's only been 70 years since we realized that, hey, that guy isn't possessed. He has a biochemical disease called schizophrenia.
It's only 50 years since we learned someone isn't lazy, they just have dyslexia. And as long as science keeps progressing, quote, the homunculus will be jammed into ever tinier places. That's what I'm talking about with that. He just imagines we're eventually going to describe everything, and I'm like, the homunculus, so eventually there's still going to be room always for the homunculus. That's my argument to Sapolsky. I would like to ask you about that if I could, Sapolsky, but we'll see. So thusly, Sapolsky argues because he doesn't believe in free will, he argues we should stop punishing people for what they do. But here's the problem. Humans love punishment.
They love it.
Quote, the decision to punish, the passionate motivation to do so is a frothy limbic state, as are the consequences of punishing. When subjects punish someone for making a lousy offer in an economic game, there's activation of dopaminergic reward systems, punishment that just feels good.
Because evolutionarily, punishing norm violations makes sense for building groups. Obviously, it would, evolution would program us to feel good when we do those norm violation punishments, because that's what creates the best groups that outcompete other groups and that continue our genetic, history.
Yeah, but Sapolsky says our dopaminergic pathways will have to find their stimulation elsewhere. We've done it before. People with epilepsy used to be burned for being witches, and the crowds loved it. Now, if you're epileptic, we take your license away, your driver's license away.
This is a great quote.
Quote, crowds of goiterous yahoos don't excitedly mass to watch the epileptic's driver's license being publicly burned, okay? We've successfully banished the notion of punishment in that realm. It may take centuries, but we can do the same in all our current arenas of punishment. What must be abolished are the views that punishment can be deserved and that punishing can be virtuous.
That is some good
wow.
Points. That's some deep Sapolsky stuff.
And that's kind of a weird way of kind of Jesus dying for our sins. We're removing your sins by me dying. I mean, that's kind of some cool, interesting stuff there.
Quote, the hope is that when it comes to dealing with humans whose behaviors are among our worst and most damaging, words like evil and soul will be as irrelevant as when considering a car with faulty brakes. That's his point. He has a funny story on a podcast where somebody complimented his shirt, and he's like, I'm the most arrogant person in the whole world because I say thank you.
Dude, it's okay to say thank you.
I decided.
That's what you're supposed to say when someone says
I decided that this was my, that I took this shirt out of the universe and said, I look good in this shirt, and, made all the decisions. Like, he's, nothing works that way.
And that's kind of a different way, kind of wrap around to describe that there's no way to live your life without thinking you have free will. Without thinking, yeah, I picked out this awesome shirt. Like, thank you for complimenting my shirt. I'm such a good selector. Even though really what he's saying is your genes, your environment, your determinism, your behavior, hormones all determine you buying that shirt, right?
Yeah.
It's like.
So here's the sum up quote for the chapter. If we deny free will when it comes to our worst behaviors, the same must apply also to our best, to our talents, our displays of willpower and focus, moments of bursting creativity, decency, and compassion. Logically, it should seem as ludicrous to take credit for those traits as to respond to a compliment on the beauty of your cheekbones by thanking the person for implicitly having praised your free will, instead of explaining how mechanical forces acted upon the zygomatic arches of your skull. Like, that's where his head head is going with
Yeah,
the shirt
dude.
thing. Like, in his view, we don't create anything. Everything just kind of happens to us. Where like this teeny system is part of this massive other system.
Dude, side note,
Great perspective.
it's great perspective, and I'm just thinking, like, if you were at like a party with Sapolsky, like, he would be so
be
hard
tough
to
to
talk
talk
to.
to. He'd be
Yeah,
tough.
he'd be so hard. He'd be like, yeah, he's
That's
not.
why he's studying baboons. He's not at
Yeah,
parties.
go to Africa.
Go
and
study more
baboons,
baboons,
bro. Like,
the last chapter.
yeah, chapter 17. War and peace. So, what is the biology of human behavior in war and peace? So interesting.
We're skipping most of
Yeah,
this
we are
chapter.
skimming and skipping so much, but we're gonna hit some good stuff here, Jay.
Check out this list of things that don't happen as much anymore. Just like the list of human universals, this is things that have happened more in our history than now, thank goodness. Forced marriages, child brides, genital mutilation, wife beating, polygamy, widow burning, persecution of homosexuals, epileptics and albinos, beating of school children, beating of beasts of burden, rule of land by an occupying army, by a colonial overlord, by an unelected dictator, illiteracy, death in infancy, death in childbirth, death from preventable disease, a lot of death, basically.
I mean, 500,000 people were killed for pleasure in the Roman Colosseum. The point he's making here is this stuff happens less than it used to.
Did you know in China, in the year 800, 36 million people died. It was called the An-Lushan Rebellion. I don't know what happened, but 1/6 of the world population was killed.
Wow.
That's something that doesn't happen anymore. No gunpowder then, too. Why does this stuff happen less than it used to? We're skipping basically everything he says about that, except here's one.
One little detail that we're going to bring to you.
This is such a good tidbit. We don't even have to explain why. This just like, we'll let you do the work. Prisoner's dilemma game. We all know that. Do you defect or do you cooperate? Well, if you're only going to play one round, obviously
You're going to defect. That's the clear. You're never going to play again. You're defecting.
But what about open-ended games? Hit him with the quote.
Quote, in other words, playing for a known number of rounds biases against cooperation, and the more rational the players, the more they foresee this. It's open-ended play that fosters cooperation, an unknown number of rounds, producing the shadow of the future where retribution is possible and the advantages of sustained mutual cooperation accumulate with increasing number of interactions. Wow.
So maybe what we're saying is, and Sapolsky, the world has become more like an open-ended prisoner's dilemma game.
Which is why we cooperate.
Yeah,
Wow.
we can cooperate because we're building things in the future. We can think, oh, my bank account's this. If I cooperate, it'll get to this. You know, there's what's that credit we talk about in Sapiens, where like the imagined future.
There's going to be more
goods are-
future games in the future, so I got to do good by it now,
So
so,
that
I can
kinda-
keep winning the games in the future.
The open-endedness of these games is what creates the shadow. What does he say? The shadow of the future potential gains.
Interaction.
Yeah.
And after you play a game for a while and gather information on the players, many higher order mammals, and especially us Homo sapiens, condense that information into an abstraction called reputation.
I think those might be my words, but like think about
That's
this.
super
Like,
cool. Yeah.
we take all of the, there's a lot of information about how the other player played that game, and we're going to combine it all into a layer, an abstraction called reputation, where we think this person seems to cooperate when I cooperate or whatever. Like you need to kind of condense it down and have like one particular reputation for an opponent or a possible cooperation person so that you know how to act in the future.
Quote, other animals don't have reputations or ponder whether their interactions are open-ended. However, punishment to promote cooperation occurs in numerous species. This is shown when a male baboon who is being an aggressive brute to a female is chased out of the troop for a while by the victim and her relatives.
Yeah, like the people that it makes sense that they would punish those, being an asshole or whatever, so that they can, better cooperate in the future, basically.
Crazy. Sapolsky talks about this cool study that looked at an Ethiopian villages with tragedy of the commons problems. They were cutting their forests for firewood.
Yeah.
And what they found out was they went to these different Ethiopian villages and they played different They had different games, economics games that they played with them. And the conclusion was villages that punished more in those economics games,
like punished norm violations and
punished like stepping outside, selfish behavior. Those villages had the healthiest forests. That's super interesting.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense too. I mean, it's almost like tied up in a little bow, you know?
Wow.
So we're talking all this good stuff about cooperation, but Sapolsky won't let us dwell on the good stuff for long. This line is so gold. He wants us to know that he's using, quote, cooperation as a value-free term. Sometimes it takes a village to ransack a neighboring village.
God, you shouldn't laugh about that, but dude, that is, at the same time, it's such good writing in a weird way, right? So he brings us back to reality to close out the book.
Yeah, so we're closing out the book now. That was the end of chapter 17, I believe. Yeah. And so now we've talked about all these classes of behavior. We've talked about all this biology affecting our behavior, and he's going to bring it home with a good sum up.
Somewhere between neurons, hormones, and genes on one hand, and cultural, ecological influences, evolution on the other, sits the individual.
Right in the middle. And enter an individual into history.
Take Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old fruit seller in Tunisia, then in its 23rd year of corrupt and repressive rule by a dictator. At the market, the police hassled Bouazizi about an imaginary permit expecting a bribe. He refused. Not out of principle, he'd often bribed, but because he lacked the money to pay the bribe. He was kicked and spat upon, his fruit cart overturned. His complaint at the government office was ignored. And within an hour of being preyed on by the police, on December 10th, 2010, Bouazizi stood in front of that government office, doused himself with gasoline, and shouted, "How do you expect me to make a living?" Set himself on fire.
Yeah, that is so crazy.
And because Bouazizi did that is so crazy, shit went down in 20 countries. We call that the Arab Spring.
20 countries.
20 countries because of one guy. Like, when you're talking about analyzing human behavior, how do you like fit that situation into your analysis, right?
From Tunisia, this is the Wikipedia, the protests spread to 5 other countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. And then sustained street demonstrations took place in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Iranian Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Sudan. Minor protests took place in Djibouti, Mauritania, Palestine, Saudi Arabia. Oh my gosh. So what's we're saying here?
Just an interesting example of one individual's biology causing ripples across human history and everyone's biology.
Yeah, I just found that just such a poignant example of, biology.
How interconnected our inner brain, our outer brain, our societies, our interactions with everyone, status games, us, thems. It's like, whoa.
Like we talk about, like causal chains of things. Like to think of one individual, one fruit seller who just like leapt orders of magnitude up into the causal chain and had a powerful impact on the whole Middle Eastern region. It's just so crazy. So,
Jay, I think we got about 10 more bullets in this entire outline, and we're going to sum the entire book up for you.
What was all the biology?
If you've made it this far, this is roughly going to be 2.5 to 3 hour podcast, by the way.
Yeah.
Here is the summary of the entire thing. I'm not supposed to slam the table, but I would be slamming.
Here's some of the sum up points.
Go for it.
The frontal cortex helps you do the right thing when it's the harder thing.
Brains and cultures co-evolve.
Biological factors like hormones mostly modulate propensities for certain behaviors, and genes mostly modulate propensities for certain traits. It's just like with genes having differing effects depending on the environment, and the environment having differing effects upon the genes. It's all these causal chain loop-de-loops. That's the main point.
Adolescence shows us that the most interesting part of the brain, the frontal cortex, is shaped the least by genes and most by the environment.
And we care more about anticipating something than having it. That was the dopamine
stuff. You can't understand aggression without understanding fear.
We distinguish us's from thems in milliseconds, even babies.
Humans take social status to extremes never even dreamed of by our fellow primates.
And neither fancy moral reasoning nor feeling great empathy necessarily translates into actually getting up and doing anything.
Shoot. People kill and are willing to be killed for symbolic sacred values.
And anyone who doesn't think we can change doesn't know enough about primate behavior.
Bang.
Yeah, so he actually...
There you have it. Yeah, he does that whole story about how the chimp troop like changed all its behaviors based on all the alpha chimps dying. I don't know if you covered that.
There was some situation where the chimp troop, all the aggressive males ate some poisonous meat, were all taken out, all killed, and the chimp troop, it was baboons, and all the baboons became much nicer to each other for a period of time. Even after a bunch of new males had joined the troop, they were still had much less displaced aggression, still much more grooming than a normal baboon troop. And so that's where I love that point that he closes on.
I was going to say,
anyone who doesn't think we could change doesn't know enough about primate behavior. Like,
and
even baboons can completely change
the whole culture of how the baboons work and live and play together. And I was going to say that he talks about that more in his book, A Primate's Memoir.
Absolutely, yeah.
And to me, that event was like one of the major events of his life. That was an event that gave this guy hope that like maybe humans could survive into the future based on that. So anyways,
if he had to boil down, he said, this is his words, in the end of the book, boiling it down to one phrase, he would say, it's complicated.
Behavior.
It's complicated.
Yeah, which is a good one. So Jay, that was Robert Sapolsky's Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. Thank you, Dr. Sapolsky. JD and I cannot describe how much you've impacted our behavior.
Yeah.
Impacted our thoughts, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully behavior too. I don't know. But like how much we talk about you, how much we learn and we think, I don't know, Jade. Like this book is a framework for how I evaluate the world.
One of the best books of all time. Our podcast is way worse than the book.
Yeah, read the book. We're only doing this because the book is so good.
Now we learned the book. Hopefully, if you already read the book, that helps. Thank you, Dr. Sapolsky. Really.
Sapolsky.
Thank you.
Keep going, man.
Please
Don't
keep writing.
Stop.
Please keep writing.
You kick ass, dude. Your books are amazing.
Yeah. All right.
Bang.
Out.
Let's go, Jay. That was good. That's content right there, okay?